What if Naruto was a sage in Percy Jackson Part 7? Reading of An Extraordinary Sage's Not So Ordinary Adventure by Red Fist Cannon. Chapter 7 Without further ado, by Father's crusty hide, the god of the sea swore. While his eldest sister looked at him scandalized, his mother, who would normally be in her well-mannered daughter's boat, was silently nodding along. I'll allow it, Rhea shrugged. Besides, Croaker's posterior was indeed crustier than burnt pita bread. She tittered silently to herself at the childish thought, getting strange looks from the two foreign goddesses next to her. On the other hand, the other two-thirds of the big three turned to their seafaring brother with an arched brow. What is it, Poseidon? Zeus asked, more curious than anything else, while his oldest brother gave the sea god an expectant look. The god in question opened his mouth to reply, before stopping himself and raising the book toward the god of the underworld. Why don't you take a look, brother? I have a feeling you'll enjoy this chapter, he said, getting a curious look from his elder sibling. Well, if you insist. With an application of telekinesis, the book flew into Hades' hands, much to Nico's amazement. The dark-haired deity smirked and opened the corresponding page, beginning the reading. Chapter 7. The name's Uzumaki, Zetsu and Uzumaki. You just might be right about something for once, brother. The siblings smirked at each other, while Hades felt a rare giddiness swell up within him. Even Zeus fought down a small harumph at the movie reference. He couldn't trust that little gremlin, and if anything, this chapter would offer him more reasons to stay wary of the Uzumaki, but he could appreciate pop culture almost as much as his son. With the demigods, the kids chuckled at the title. Name's Jackson, Percy Jackson. The boy in question spoke in a snobby tone, tipping an imaginary hat to Annabeth, who giggled at his antics and tipped back her cap. Chase, Annabeth Chase. Charmed, I'm sure, she said back with a tone just as snooty, even raising her hand daintily. Percy squinted his eyes at her hand, not knowing what to do, then just grabbed it and shook it, making the blonde smile become strained. Seaweed brain, she thought fondly. The village hidden in the leaves had always been a beautiful sight at sunset, but never more so than on the eve of October 10th. Many in the audience blinked at the strange name, with several questions already forming. I've never heard of such a place, Athena commented as she racked her brain for any mention of this village, be it in present times or throughout history. The closest thing to it was the Kakureizado. Remote villages from feudal Japan that were only rumored to be dwelling places for the ninja, so could this place be? It's Pepito's hometown, Quetzalcoatl answered the goddess of wisdom's inspoken question. Again, many blinked in surprise. Were they getting into the origins of the sage? Oh, so we're getting a glimpse into Super Gramps era? Apollo asked with an undertone of excitement. Are we gonna see ninjas? Piped up Nico while Percy grinned next to him. Their enthusiasm was shared among the demigods. However, unlike some, Amaterasu felt some dread wash over her. While she had always been curious about her papa's past, and part of her was excited at finally getting a glimpse at it alongside her sister, she also understood this was a private subject. If it came down to her, she'd likely shut this reading down and cover the screen. If what her uncle Kurama had said was correct, then she didn't want her father's pain to be put on display for the entertainment of foreign spirits. Especially, those who would likely use this information against her dear papa. Don't bother him too much about it, kid. Uncle Kurama had told her once after she'd prodded Naruto for answers, your father wasn't in a good place when we found him again after the great cataclysm that ended the old world. He still isn't to this day, but he's trying, he's getting better. After her conversation with him, she understood that his past was simply too painful for him to delve into again in detail, especially when he still held the mental and physical scars to this day. She exchanged a look with her sister, who for once, looked just as serious as her. As obnoxious and childish as Quatsi was, she loved her father just as much as her sister. They'd be damned if they'd allowed anyone to ever use his past trauma to hurt him. Following the Fourth Shinobi World War, what used to be a day of sadness and mourning for those fallen to the Kyuubi's attack 25 years ago, had been turned into a time of celebration. Kyuubi? As in the nine-tailed fox of legend? Athena asked in curiosity. It might be ironic coming from us, but I had always assumed that one to be a myth. There have been confirmed sightings of kitsunes with tails ranging from 1 to 8, but never 9. That's cause Tio's the only one, Chica, Quetzalcoatl replied, earning everyone's attention. Wait. You're related to the Kyuubi no Kitsune? Apollo almost squealed in excitement. The lore about the Kyuubi was as large as it was diverse. Multiple contradicting tales surrounded it, with the creature appearing as everything from an eldritch monstrosity to a shape-shifting trickster spirit. Amaterasu tried to signal for her sister to shut up, but the Aztec didn't seem to catch on as she puffed out her chest. Es el más grande y fuerte de la familia. Her bold declaration got some surprised looks from the ones who understood her, especially her recent admirer. Even stronger than Super Gramps? Aries asked his crush, intent on finding out more about the family he'd, hopefully, meet in the future and whether or not he had a long way to go to impress them. The Shinto deity sighed to herself at her sibling's big mouth, but decided to clarify and avoid further questions. I'll simply say that in my entire life, I have never met any being with a higher chakra output than our eldest uncle. You'd think we'd hear or see more of him if that's the case, Demeter commented, raising a good point, but was puzzled by Amaterasu's chuckles. When Papa discovered Overworked, the Sage Realm, Uncle Kurama was the first to move there and never looked back. He made himself a den far away in the wild and stayed there, she explained. I think it's because Tio Zoro just likes sleeping all the time. The Aztec chirped then giggled, he gets so mad every time we interrupt his siestas. Only because you have no self-control, Quatsi. He almost blew up the mountain last time because you pulled on his ears, the Shinto said only for her sister to whine. But they're so cute and algodoncholo. How can anyone resist putting their hands on them? The Aztec defended herself, and don't act so innocent, Hermana. Pepito told me about you sleeping in Tio's fur. That was only as a child. Mentarosa, you did it last month. Why you? The two siblings proceeded to get into another cartoonish dust cloud, while the demigods inched away. Percy and Talia did have to physically carry Annabeth, who was too focused on taking notes about the Kyuubi to pay attention to the ensuing chaos. While most of the Olympians looked either worried at the explanation or mildly amused at the sibling fight, with Ares even silently cheering his crush on, Hestia and Rhea moved to break up the fight. Only Zeus sat with a serious expression as he remembered an old meeting he had with his two rival kings. The nine-tailed fox is said to be a calamity given form. I would go so far as to compare him to our own Jormungandr, Odin the All-Father had said gravely at the time. It was a tidbit he kept close to his chest. Even if his brothers knew about the sage and some of the other pantheonic threats, the less they knew about those beasts, the better. Lest they try to use them to overthrow him. Both as a way to honor the fallen heroes of the war and as a way of atonement toward one whom they had wrongfully scorned for years. 4th. Shinobi. World. War. Ares discreetly crossed his legs. Damn it, the book was getting him bricked up. Why couldn't World War III start already? His sister Enyo should be in Afghanistan about now, so maybe he could sneak in something with a bit more oomph for the Taliban operating there, just for shits and giggles. Athena would be so mad too. Always a plus in his book. War didn't discriminate and he lived for it. Athena, sensing her brother's rising bloodlust, rolled his eyes at the god's savage nature. Hades, meanwhile, was just silently glad he didn't have to deal with that mess or the 3 Shinobi world wars before it. The bureaucracy of it all would have given him nightmares. Rhea raised a brow at the last statement. Could it be referring to the sage? The Will of Fire Festival had become a national holiday for families and loved ones to reinforce their bonds, let go of past grievances, and look forward to a brighter future together. Hestia felt flattered. Even if the festival wasn't about her, with the name and the idea behind it, it was an occasion to honor the values she held dear. While the Greeks did have Saturnalia, it was not a holiday that the elder Olympians were keen on celebrating for obvious reasons. Sounds like a fun time, Dionysus commented. Festivals and parties were his shtick, even if that one sounded too wholesome for his tastes. I agree, it sounds delightful, the goddess of the hearth clapped. So it's like the Golden Festival, Quetzalcoatl muttered, earning the attention of Rhea and those close enough to hear her. Annabeth, ever the curious one, and feeling more comfortable with the foreign goddesses, had to ask, Lady Quetzalcoatl, is that something your family celebrates? I said call me Quatsi. The Aztec pouted at the demi-goddess who nodded shyly, but yeah, it's so cool. It's a party in the whole realm. The deity had stars in her eyes as she spoke. Her excitement was shared with her sister, who nodded as well. Some of the Shinto attended every year. Gekko always has his fashion show, the local diva visibly perked up in interest, and Suchi-kun has his mecha show. This time, the local grease monkey raised a brow in curiosity. Mecha show, fashion show. Both husband and wife asked at the same time, before side-eyeing one another. HMPH, of course you'd care about such a crass thing, Aphrodite sniffed disdainfully. And of course you'd care about such a useless thing, Hephaestus grunted with an eye roll. Quatsi winced to herself and whispered to her sister, oof, he better not let Gekka hear him say that. Amaterasu nodded, true, Gekko can be vicious when his craft is insulted. The Shinto god of love and marriage was a passionate and eccentric fellow. Both when it came to romance and his own interests. He was not alone in that behavior as many in their family often behaved in an obnoxious fashion. To Amaterasu, it all stemmed from one of her father's philosophies. Throughout the many millennia he's been alive, the gallant sage of the East had lived through many lifetimes, each with their own experiences and each with their own lessons. One of those lessons remained etched in the man's mind to this day, so much so that it became a motto, a reminder to try and live one's life without regrets, and that means, do what you want. 1. Amaterasu's father had repeated those decisive words to her many times in the past, particularly when she felt burdened by a heavy choice or felt apprehensive about a new experience. It was a sign that he both trusted her to make the right choice, and a way to help her grow and even make her own mistakes. But all of this was to say that some of the Shinto had taken to her father's advice like fish to water, and while they did not necessarily shirk their duties, they gave their respective passions more time than before, and became more eccentric individuals as a result. Be it Kagutsuchi and his obsession with mechs, Musashi and his inhuman training regimen, Gekko and his quest to beautify everyone around him, Archange with her performative attitude, or the many other gods who became more passionate about their own lifestyle choices. This change in their pantheon, especially following World War II, did end up creating an influence on Japanese society, effectively countering the widespread conformism and giving rise to a more progressive generation, even if it was a slow process. Amaterasu shuddered as she imagined the image of her pantheon had someone like Tsukuyomi taken charge. The Shinto god of the moon was a traditionalist through and through, as well as someone she'd had to keep on a tight leash on for as long as she'd known him, lest a second Hachiman situation arose. 2. Furthermore, while the festival found its roots in the land of fire, it had quickly spread to the rest of the elemental nations, from the furthest peaks of the land of lightning to the arid deserts of the land of wind and even remote islands like the Crescent Moon Kingdom. Crescent Moon Kingdom, Artemis hummed to herself. I like it, she stated with a smile. Zoe from her side mentally imagined a country in her lady's image, and wondered if she could learn more about the ancient kingdom. Perhaps they could organize an expedition with the hunters to look for any clues about it. While they weren't related to the goddess of wisdom, the hunters would go to great lengths to please their benefactor. HMPH, what's this about a land of lightning? The king raised a brow in curiosity. Oh, don't let it get to your head. The old world simply had a bizarre way of naming things, Poseidon drawled, rolling his eyes at his brother. He could practically see his ego inflate in real time. Ha! You're simply envious, like anyone would name a country after something as weak as water. Zeus turned up his head. Before Poseidon could retort, Amaterasu decided to cut in. Actually, the Shinto deity raised a finger, her face amused as she interrupted the king's self-aggrandizement. There was such a country, and it was very much the opposite of weak. The god of the sea turned to her in interest, a smug look slowly making its way to his face. With an amused smile, and mischief in her eyes, Amaterasu continued, in fact it was known for its military village, which became infamous for its brutality and savagery. That statement wiped the smug smile off Poseidon's face as he looked at the goddess dryly. Not the bloody mist again. Quetzalcoatl suddenly whined audibly and slumped in her seat, attracting attention. Why did Tia Saiken and Tio Isobu even give us lectures about it? I mean the stuff about but the seven swordsmen of the mist was genial and all, but the politics reminded me too much of Huitzilopochtli's Basura. 7 swordsmen of the mist? Ares perked up, a sword raised at the ready. Politics? Athena perked up as well, her notebook at the ready. The Aztec's complaint earned her a look from her sister. It's necessary, Quatsi. Aunt Saiken wants us to avoid making the mistakes of the past, and you know what that place did to your uncle. The Shinto waved a finger at her sibling. Their more demure uncle Isobu had, like most of their siblings, spent decades essentially enslaved by the shinobi of that village and used as a weapon for war. Oog, but it's so boring, the blonde goddess groaned like a child. Here we go again. Zeus could feel a migraine growing as the 2 foreign siblings got into another fight. It's as if we didn't already have our hands full with the twins, Hera muttered, referring to Apollo and Artemis' constant squabbles. Rhea and Hestia looked almost tired at the sight of the siblings. This had gotten old very fast. Overlooking the great military village was a mountain decorated with 6 stone heads, each one carved in remembrance of the Hokages, old and new, who led and protected their home. Many of the gods blinked at the sight, while the most studious among them hurriedly noted down her observations in her notebook. First the Gregorian calendar and now a shinobi version of Mount Rushmore. It's either a coincidence or evidence of the old world influencing ours, Athena muttered. Annabeth heard her mother and scratched her head. She couldn't begin to fathom how this could happen, but she was hungry for more nonetheless. Her pen blurred over the pages as she jotted down everything she could. She hoped the book would answer so many of her questions, especially the ones she's had since a young age. So their leaders were named. Hokage. Hades rubbed his chin in thought. It means fire shadow, uncle, Apollo translated, getting a raised brow from both Hestia and Hephaestus. The god of the underworld nodded approvingly alongside his youngest son. The title was very interesting. From atop the fourth Hokage's head sat a man. Dressed in a dark orange short shirt kimono and matching pants, the man shrugged the blue haori he wore over the ensemble, folded it neatly, and set it to the side. Aphrodite squinted at the ensemble then nodded slightly. It was acceptable compared to the travesties she'd seen Naruto wear in the other chapters. Did immortality dull his sense of fashion? Maybe I can fix that. His cerulean blue eyes gazed down at streets bathed in an orange glow, at the food and entertainment stands being set up in anticipation of the festivities, at the families touring the decorations, at the couples basking in the joyous ambiance, at the children living the time of their lives as they chased one another around the marketplace. Even after everything he had gone through in these streets, all the hardships and obstacles he had surmounted to earn the people's acknowledgement, the man had never stopped thinking of this place as his home. Stop teasing us with the edgy backstory, Hermes moaned to himself. Either talk about it in detail or don't pussyfoot around it. It's just a plot device to keep the readers interested, his half-brother commented while rubbing his chin. He did feel annoyed at the lack of details too, especially since his suspicions about the sage being his all-time favorite fictional character were gaining more ground with each chapter, but he could respect the writing effort. Rhea and Hestia both frowned at their younger relatives. While also curious about the sage's background, they weren't about to treat it with such nonchalance, especially when the man also existed in their universe and most probably also went through the same things his counterpart did. Aphrodite, ever a fan of drama, was also interested for another reason. She promptly added tragic past to her sleeping with the DILF list, and underlined it several times under the pro section. I can fix him, the goddess licked her lips. A grizzled warrior with a dark origin opening up and showing his vulnerability to her as she meticulously healed his physical and mental scars. Just imagining it sent a shiver through her spine. Unlike some of the gods, most of the demigods felt both curious and sympathetic. While they still didn't know much about the sage's past, the knowledge that he probably also had a terrible childhood only made him feel more relatable to them. Yo, Dobie, a stoic voice said behind him. Would I want, bastard? The blond man's words were uttered by reflex as if the use of such an insult was not less but an affectionate greeting for the two. Hestia balked at the language. How rude. Unlike her, many other gods let out chuckles at the crass greeting, namely Ares, Quetzalcoatl, Apollo and Hermes. That's just how homies greet homies, the sun god grinned before turning to his favorite half-brother with his fist raised. Am I right, dickhead? Shithead. The god of mischief looked touched as he bumped fists with his sibling. You always know what to say. Insert angry Hestia noises unseen to most. Luke snorted in what would have become a chuckle, if he didn't stamp it out first. Wouldn't do to have his father think he was warming up to him. The man behind him, one with a far less colorful appearance and demeanor, huffed with a smirk and sat next to him. The large black cloak he wore was taken off and put to the side, revealing a shirt and pants of the same color. Peculiarly, one of the sleeves was tied at the elbow with the rest of the limb missing from there. But what was even more peculiar were the man's eyes. His right eye possessed a red iris with what looked like 3 spinning tomos surrounding the pupil, while his left eye was even more bizarre. Lacking an iris, the eye's sclera was a glowing purple, with concentric circles topped with 9 tomos surrounding the pupil. Oh, Aphrodite began fanning herself. Oh my. Her eyes might as well have turned into hearts as she gazed upon Sasuke's image. Quel délice pour les yeux, she commented in French. It seems her intuition about that dark-haired boy in the previous chapter was correct. He did indeed grow up into her flavor of baby daddy. While her comment received eye rolls from many others, some of the ladies did silently agree with the goddess of love. The darker-haired mortal held a soft, almost feminine face, contrasted by an obviously athletic body and sharp features, while his darker outfit only served to complement his appearance. All in all, he looked like the protagonist of a romance novel, the kind that would have women falling over themselves to gain his attention. It's your birthday, Sasuke replied while looking down at the village alongside his companion. Didn't know why you'd spend it up here. Hey, happy birthday Gramps. Percy, now a great fan of the sage, shouted out from his seat, prompting Nico and Talia to let out similar greetings. The sight drew a smile from several Greeks, as well as the Amaterasu and Quetzalcoatl. He looks about 25, Athena muttered, her great mind already making the connections and drawing a possible conclusion regarding the festival's date. The way the book put it, the sage's birth might be related to that mysterious Kyuubi attack. But why spend it alone? Hermes asked. While immortals didn't celebrate every single one of their birthdays after a certain point, they did make parties occasionally to celebrate a new century or one of them reaching a new millennia. It was Quetzalcoatl who answered him with a small frown. Pepito never liked his birthday, always said it held nothing but bad memories for him. That's Rhea trailed off, now apprehensive. It was similar to why she initially had a hard time celebrating her own children's birthdays, except for Zeus, which had caused a small rift between him and his brothers, much to her regret. It was simply a reminder of those dark days, when she could only helplessly watch her monster of an ex-husband rip her children away from her, not even minutes after their birth. It had all changed of course after the Titanomachy, but from what the sage's daughter said, it seemed like Naruto had never moved on from whatever events affected him. Hestia frowned sadly alongside her mother, as she also felt affected by the rising negative emotions from the Titaness and the two foreign goddesses. The demigods likewise frowned. They were still children, and birthdays, to them, were just the one day of the year you should enjoy. Even Luke, who's been trying to keep himself out of sight, couldn't help but agree. Ah, Sasuke, never knew you cared. I don't, Naruto. Sasuke shot down almost instantly. Daum. The distant shout made Hades look up and glare at his nephews. Before the infuriatingly smug smirk that his clan was infamous for made its way to his face, but Sakura and the others have been on my back the entire day about your whereabouts, and I needed some peace. He looked at the blonde with a raised brow. I thought brooding was my shtick. The blonde before him chuckled good naturally. Look at you, 25 but complaining about married life like an old man. His words earned him an eye roll, but no verbal response. Zeus damn near bit his tongue off to stop any comment he wanted to make. He could practically feel the heat from his wife's glare at the back of his head. He wouldn't say anything though. Nothing about how he sympathized with the raven-haired man. Nope. He might have his own temple, but Hera could still banish him to the couch. That cold, uncomfortable, uncurvy couch. The ravenet rolled his eyes but came closer to the blonde. There's actually another reason I came here, he said and raised a hand to Naruto's ear. Something from Kakashi-sensei? The blonde man listened as his friend whispered something. Isn't that the sage's master? The one he talked about before? Annabeth asked, remembering the flashback in Chapter 5. His cerulean blue eyes widened. What is it? Don't leave us hanging. Woo. A scream of joy reverberated over the village as the blonde man sailed over it, performing cartwheels in midair. Wow, even as a mortal he could jump. Apollo whistled at the sight. Talia shook her head. How he can do this is beyond me. My heart wouldn't take it. Bianca, while not acrophobic, had to nod her head with her cousin. Sasuke let out a rare smile at his friend's excitement. Naruto's antics never got old, even as the man launched himself off the Hokage monument, bearing a smile that could very well cramp his facial muscles. As the ground approached, the man maneuvered his body to land on a nearby electric pole, switching his pace up to a faster series of small jumps between the buildings of the main street of the village, figuratively and literally bouncing off the walls of the entire district. Must be some really good news. Hey, Hermes smiled. He used to do the same as a Godeling. He'd given his own mother a lot of trouble as she had to clean his footprints off the walls and ceiling every time he got a bit excited. As if reading his thoughts, his brother chuckled. Reminds me of when you had your first demigod. Your temple might as well have been a bounce house. As he said this, Apollo threw a side glance down at Luke. While he didn't feel as much disdain as some of the other Olympians for the traitor, he also felt the boy could be redeemed, especially if both his aunt and grandma were vouching for his rehabilitation. It'd do good for Hermes to have some positive PR with the kid. Show the boy his dad at least cared. Children gawked and pointed at the display, while the nearby adults didn't give much of a reaction other than some curiosity at the man's exuberant laughing. Most citizens on the street were very much accustomed to the wild movements of most shinobi. I'm gonna be an uncle. Naruto's announcement echoed throughout the streets, garnering a lot of attention from the villagers. That's wonderful. Hestia clapped happily, while her mother giggled in delight at the news. More babies was always a good thing. Congratulations, Gramps. Talia and the children hooted and hollered together. They were genuinely happy for the old sage. Similarly, everyone either muttered some congratulations or shrugged in disinterest. With how many demigods they had every year, this kind of news was the average Tuesday. Even from such a large distance, the Uchiha could still spot the familiar silhouette of his friend bouncing off the walls, randomly hugging passers-by and tossing children into the air before catching them. It was such a typical Naruto thing to do that Sasuke couldn't help but snort in amusement. It was refreshing to see that, despite everything that happened in the past, his friend retained that very same happy-go-lucky attitude that had annoyed him and everyone else to no end when they were children, and even today to some degree. So he's always been a clown. Oh joy, Hera snorted, heedless of the glares she received from Amaterasu and Quetzalcoatl, and surprisingly, a side eye from her own mother. While she recognized the man's power, his character made it hard for her to respect him. If there was one thing she and her husband could both agree on, it was the importance of maintaining their image. One would expect someone of the sage's renown and stature to know and apply this basic principle. But no, all she's been seeing lately is an annoying buffoon with too much power for his own good and a sense of humor terrifyingly similar to her own mother. She did not want to think about Ria and Naruto ever meeting or, chaos forbid, hitting it off. In a way, both men had been two sides of the same coin. Both were forged in tragedy, both were determined to grow strong for selfish reasons, and as he'd found out later on, both were destined to walk opposing paths, and eventually fight to the bitter end. Fortunately for him, the one characteristic he'd always underestimated was Naruto's mule-like stubbornness when it came to defying fate itself. Talia felt stricken by how familiar this description sounded to her in Luke's past. As her eyes roamed over the room, they crossed paths with her former friend's brown pair. They didn't say anything, but somehow, both understood what the other was thinking, and even with the son of Hermes' brief look of guilt, Talia's heart hardened and her brows furrowed as she looked away. She couldn't forgive him, she couldn't afford to, but unlike her, it seems the sage hadn't given up on his friend, so could she. Could she be as stubborn too? Did she need to? Could she afford to? Snapping out of his musings, the ravenet looked down once again at the village and vanished in a swirl of leaves. Cool, Nico squealed. The boy had stars in his eyes as he saw the technique. He wanted to do that too. If you wish to do something similar, you could learn shadow travel. Hades chuckled at his son's enthusiasm, then he looked at Bianca. Both of you, that is. Can you teach us, Dad? Please, 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 the boy asked, despite his sister trying to calm him down. He was drooling at the thought of being like a ninja. Bianca, as opposed to her brother, only felt apprehensive. The hyperactive Nico with teleportation was a recipe for disaster. The other demigods couldn't fault the kid. Teleportation was awesome. Perhaps later. The god of the underworld smiled softly at his children, inwardly patting himself on the back for successfully bridging a bond with them. He reappeared not a second later near his friend, only to quickly dodge a tackle from the blonde. Naruto grinned as he gave chase in an attempt to embrace his best friend, while the Uchiha used his superhuman reflexes to dodge any and all physical affection. He didn't need to do it for long, however. Come on, you big lug, give your bro some shuga ayaya. A painful ear pinch cut off the Uzumaki mid-sentence as his entire body seized in pain. Everyone in the room, sans the Titaness, winced at the sight. Ria raised a brow in amazement. It was not every day one could witness a mortal flawlessly perform the pinches of motherly fury. TM. Damn it, Naruto. I don't need the entire village to know. You ain't exactly hiding it, Sakura. Ow ow OWWWW. This time, the men collectively winced at the blunder. He's putting his foot in his mouth a lot, the god of messengers chuckled. With the size of his clown shoes, that's not difficult to do. His half-brother earned himself a high five for the joke. Although his smile wilted when he spied Amaterasu sending him a small glare. Tone down the clown comments, got it. Sasuke chuckled as he caught sight of the perpetrator. Dressed in a large red robe to accommodate her round belly, Sakura Uchiha, nee Haruno, cut a fierce sight even with her unique pink hair and matching pink slippers. The Uchiha male looked on at his wife, who, even in her heavily pregnant state, berated the, arguably, strongest man on the planet for his obnoxious public display. That's one heck of an achievement, Demeter muttered with an impressed look. So he already wielded monstrous power even as a mortal? Now that's a title. Ares felt the same way. Makes me want to fight him more, he declared, earning another reprimand from Hestia. Quetzalcoatl raised a brow at the war god's proclamation. He was interesting. Pepito didn't have too many challengers nowadays, and it was getting boring to see him fight or spar with only his kids or Moto. Hell, thinking back on it, she didn't have many challengers either. She meant serious challengers too, not the weirdos that kept trying to have her crush their skulls between her muzzlos. There was Musashi, but every single fight with him ended with one of them either maimed or very injured, followed by a lengthy lecture from Pepito. Between her monthly lucha libre tournaments, and annoying her big sis, maybe having someone she could spar, relatively safely, with would be fun. She just hoped Pepito wouldn't scare the guy away like he did to those other weirdos. With her decision made, Quetzalcoatl nodded to herself and turned to give Ares a thumbs up. The god in question, seeing his crush sending him a sign of approval, was reduced to a blushing mess, as he turned to the side bashfully and covered his golden cheeks. It cut a humorous sight, seeing the scarred and punkish god being reduced to a love-struck maiden. On the inside though, yes, one step closer to getting a glam slam from my BRICC queen. It was still so surreal to him. These were two people he'd tried to murder in the past, and when it came to the blonde, had almost succeeded on several occasions. Wait, what? The sudden revelation took many of the audience by surprise. It was especially shocking to the family-oriented immortals, who felt their views on the man take a complete 180 turn, and Talia, Annabeth, and Percy, who were in a similar situation in regards to their former friend Luke. Drama boom. The love goddess quipped, while her lover nodded approvingly in a rare instance of common interest. There was absolutely a violent story there, and Aries was all for it. Amaterasu, on the other hand, crossed her arms with an angered frown. That somewhat lined up with what her uncles had told her about Sasuke Uchiha, a vengeful and power-obsessed prick whom her papa never abandoned for fear of losing whatever frail friendship they had developed as children. And yet, despite all the trials he'd put them through, they've never stopped thinking of him as their comrade. Sakura's love for him never faded. Yeesh, poor girl, Demeter shook her head. The goddess of love was conflicted. On one hand, the girl was in love, which was always a plus in her book. On the other hand, that sounded like a more toxic relationship than Zeus and Hera's, or hers and her husband. Zoe and Artemis both shook their heads in disappointment. Yet another example of a poor maiden taken advantage of. It was also another reason for them to shun the idea of romance. Naruto refused to sever their bond. How did he do it? Talia's whisper was only heard by her cousins and Annabeth, but it got them pondering the implications. How did Super Gramps Naruto find the strength to forgive someone like that? Could she do the same? Should she do the same? Or was the old man an exception? She snapped out of her troubled look when she felt a pair of hands on her shoulders. Both Annabeth and Percy smiled at her, easing her worries a bit. We'll just have to wait and see. Thals, the blonde demi-goddess, spoke softly, guessing her friend's thoughts from her look alone. They'd have to wait and see. Hell, even when he'd made plans to leave and wander the world in self-imposed exile as a form of repentance, the Uzumaki had hunted him down like a bloodhound and dragged him back once more. You think this is a movie or something? I ain't got time for this. A frustrated Naruto had yelled at the time, utterly done with his so-called edgy ass. Apollo and Hermes both snickered at the image on the screen. He looks so done with him. Hey, Demeter commented with an amused smile. How far along are you? Wait, don't tell me. I can guess by your size. OWWWWW. Several of the men winced again, bringing their fists to their mouths, and let out an ooh at the faux pas. Balls of celestial bronze, that one. Hephaestus chortled. As socially inept as he was, even he knew better than to make a comment about a lady friend's size. Brain of mush, more likely, Hera sniffed disdainfully. That was not a comment to be made about a lady. Are you calling me fat? Idiot. That lack of tact is exactly why you're still single. Oh come on. I got all my life ahead to settle down. Let me enjoy my youth. Hear hear, Apollo cheered, ignoring Hera's glare at his back. The bachelor life rocked. And now you're sounding like Guy and Lee. I swear Naruto, if you start wearing green pajamas, I'm almost afraid to ask. The goddess of love began before she paled dramatically, as if sensing something. Wait, don't, she desperately screamed at the screen. As if to mock her, a large 4K HD picture of Konoha's beautiful green beasts appeared on the screen. Both Guy and Lee were hugging each other tightly with manly tears pouring from their eyes, as the background of the picture and somehow the surroundings of the screen shifted to show a sunset by the sea. Ah, my eyes, my poor innocent immortal eyes. Children, don't look. Ew. Pandemonium erupted among the audience. Some reactions were extreme, such as Aphrodite fainting with foam in her mouth, Arie practically throwing herself atop the demigods to shield them from the horrid sight, or Apollo weeping like a traumatized war veteran as he, for once, regretted having his perfect vision. Most simply looked away from the sight. Athena herself, while internally horrified, was unconsciously jotting down theories about clothing-induced hallucinations. Others, such as Dionysus or Hades, simply shrugged, very used to seeing mortals at their lowest points or in depraved situations. Sasuke tuned out the rest of their bickering. Hey, these two would never change. Everyone slowly calmed down, as Ares fanned Aphrodite to wake her back up, and Hestia helped her mother up from her position atop of the children, the latter who were very much not enjoying their grandma's large body squishing them. For some reason, a foreboding feeling nagged at him. All of this, it was too good to be true. His sins were forgiven. His dreams were at hand, his future was secured. His happiness had almost reached its peak. I have a bad feeling about this, Annabeth whispered. She'd read enough books to know what this type of scene could lead to. So then why did he feel so afraid? Rumble. Everyone jumped at the sudden loud sound. The noise was akin to crackling earth, something you'd hear during a violent earthquake as the land was upheaved. What's happening? Percy blinked, feeling an involuntary shiver travel down his spine. As if invoked by his thoughts, the earth itself began to tremble, and the Uchiha's head spiked with pain as an immense power surge appeared. Jinxed it, Apollo shook his head. Rhea gripped her chair with worry. Could this be her mother's doing? This isn't good, Zeus muttered, his thoughts mirroring the Titan. Sasuke clutched his left eye and immediately turned to glare at the source. Both Naruto and Sakura had also stopped in their tracks, their bodies reflexively tensing from the titanic wave of energy. All around them, the previously jovial atmosphere had all but been replaced by one of dread and panic, as Chunin and Genin alike mobilized for crowd control while the higher ranks took up battle stations, searching for any sign of an enemy. With his greater eyesight, the Uchiha was able to make out a feminine figure floating high above the village. Flowing white hair billowing alongside a large robe of the same color. The woman possessed regal and soft features that could very much be called unearthly beautiful. That's the scary lady from before. Nico was the first to notice, having remembered the pictures they were shown before. Rei's knuckles whitened. Despite the woman's bizarre appearance, she felt a strange sense of familiarity with her. Likewise, Demeter, Hades, and even Artemis felt some form of bond to the woman, even if they couldn't discern it. But what alarmed him the most was the third eye glowing red in the middle of her forehead. The hell? Kaguya? Naruto sputtered in shock, while Sakura mirrored his expression. Kaguya? That's the woman Zetsu named in Chapter 2, Athena noted down, the one who created the first Zetsu. The evil Zetsu? Taliah scratched her head, trying to keep up with all the lore. Sasuke could understand the surprise. They had personally sealed that monstrous self-proclaimed goddess years ago after all, and in a pocket dimension to boot. Zeus nodded, quite impressive for a mortal, he muttered, while Hera nodded along. Maybe we should have done the same to father, Poseidon pondered. Maybe the entire mess with Atlas would have been avoided had they put Croker in his own personal prison that they could monitor. Demeter and Hestia agreed as well. It would certainly be more efficient and could ease up their worries for the future. Rhea shrugged, not really caring either way, as long as her prayers for her ex's downfall came through. Tartarus is certainly treacherous, but even I can't keep track of all of father's followers, Hades chimed in, for once agreeing with his brothers. It would make it so the trouble was away from his doorstep as well. I will start working on a formula if you will. Zeus, the goddess of wisdom, seeing the opportunity to tackle an old project of hers, didn't hesitate to volunteer. Hephaestus raised a brow in interest, and flipped a page in his notebook to start jotting down some ideas as well. The king thought it over, then nodded. Even if it wasn't against the Titan King, a personalized cage or prison only they could open was always a good thing to have. Everyone. The three turned to see their old teacher, now village leader, decked out in full military gear and sporting a deathly serious expression as opposed to his usual aloof one. All around him they spotted several cloaked figures, each of their faces hidden behind white animal masks, as well as many of their lifelong comrades, all with all manner of weaponry or battle items drawn out. Battle stations, son. Ares cheered at the sight. Nothing got his blood pumping more than a battle. Those are so cool. Taliah, who loved everything punk and edgy, was the first to comment. Percy raised a hand. Can we get masks like that for camp? His question was met with the sound of thunder. Denied. Zeus' refusal was as sudden and striking as his power. The camp attire is both effective and traditional. Adding ridiculous animal masks to it is out of the question. The king glared down at the demigods. Surprisingly, Artemis was the one to interject in favor of Percy's comment. Strange as it is, I do see some use to the attire. A cloak could help with camouflage and a face mask could hide one's intentions while giving some minor protection, the huntress mused. Raising a finger, Zoe offered her point of view, not to oppose my lady's point, but would a mask not hinder one's sight? Before the huntress could respond on the issue, the room shook once again with the sound of thunder. I have already laid down my decision on the matter. Zeus spoke loudly and firmly, this time shifting his harsh gaze upon his favorite daughter. Marshmallow for his little girls he may be, but the king had an image to uphold in public. His mother and siblings rolled their eyes at his behavior. Honestly, Sparky, the Titaness pouted up at her son, while he squawked at the nickname, as some hushed giggles erupted all around. Would it be so shocking if the camp made some adjustments? Her pun resulted in groans all around. Mother. The king almost whined, which to some like Percy and Taliah was something they never expected to see from him. Ooh, if we're doing makeovers, can I help? Orange shirts are simply a horrendous color for my darlings. The goddess of love chimed in, eager as ever for anything involving her domains. No. The reply came from nearly every god. Ah. Amaterasu and Quetzalcoatl chuckled at the interaction. She better not let Papa hear her opinion about orange. the raven-haired goddess whispered to her sister, drawing a laugh from her. Our priority is civilian evacuation and damage control. The masked man barked, while looking at his subordinates, before turning to his 3 former students. Sakura, you need to join the others in the bunkers, and before the pink-haired woman could retort, he switched his gaze to Naruto and Sasuke. She wasn't seriously thinking about fighting while pregnant, was she? Hera wondered in astonishment. Artemis and Zoe, upon hearing that, were conflicted on whether to call it stupid or brave. You two, go wild. Just as the silver-haired man spoke, everyone tensed again as their enemy's power briefly skyrocketed and a dense ball of blackish energy began forming above her. That's not good. Immediately, Naruto's body was wreathed in golden flames as black markings appeared all over his body. With a roar, he rocketed up to meet the mad goddess, intent on stopping her attack. Many were excited for the oncoming fight, namely Aries and Quetzalcoatl, but none reacted more animatedly than the son of Poseidon. A Super Saiyan. Super Gramps is a Super Saiyan. Percy jumped up and down like a kid, stars exploding out of his eyes. His uber-favorite anime had come to life. Super what? His cousin tried to ask, but Percy ignored the question. A Super Saiyan. A real-life Super Saiyan. Wait. The boy felt the hamster wheel inside his head begin turning at unprecedented speeds. The god said Super Gramps was also in this world. Super Gramps met his younger self in the other world and treated him nicely and solved all of his mom's problems. He still needed to build the guy a shrine when he came back to camp. Super Gramps in this world would probably do the same. Which meant, Miss Amaterasu. The boy ran to the foreign goddess, ignoring Talia and Annabeth's shouts. Before he even got to the goddess' seat, Percy had already went down on his knees with his hands clasped before him in prayer, his momentum continuing to carry him toward the Shinto's feet. The Shinto blinked as the kid slid toward her like a soccer player, while Poseidon damn near threw himself at them to stop this foolishness. He knew his boy was rash, but he might actually cause an interpantheonic incident. Even Rhea turned to the boy in surprise. Please let me be Super Saiyan Gramps' student. The boy put on his best puppy dog eyes while the goddess looked at him and blinked, her face devoid of emotion as she processed both the request and her papa's new nickname. The air in the room became tense. Poseidon prepared to summon his trident in case the Shinto deity decided to smite his son, while Rhea nervously looked back and forth between the two. The tension was cut swiftly as a smile suddenly bloomed on Amaterasu's beautiful face. She raised a hand to cover her mouth. Her cheeks puffed out as she began to giggle. Pffffft, foo. The deity giggled, turning to the side, and her sister, ever the exuberant sibling, let loose a loud guffaw. Kahahaha. You're a funny niño, Percy. Quetzalcoatl got up and grabbed the boy by his shoulders, and lifted him off the ground. Ack. The son of Poseidon yelped as he was thrown up on his feet. His head was then smushed into the Aztec's side as she grabbed him in a headlock and gave him a playful noogie. Quatsi, let the poor boy go. The amused voice of her sister cut through her laughter. Despite blushing because of the close contact, Percy composed himself enough to look up. His sea-green eyes were met with a Shinto's amethyst pair. The goddess smiled down at him. I'm sure Papa would be very flattered by your comparison and your desire. She started, then looked toward both Rhea and Poseidon. But maybe you should discuss such an important life decision with your family first. Papa's disciples typically move to the Sage Realm to train with him. Percy looked conflicted, and both his dad and Nana shook their heads at him. Even Zeus looked like he swallowed a lemon at the possibility of a powerful demigod jumping ships, pun not intended. Before anyone could start another argument, Hestia moved between the two foreigners and pried her nephew away from Quetzalcoatl's grip. I do believe we could postpone this discussion for later. The goddess looked at everyone as they reluctantly turned back to listen to the story. Sasuke, not one to be outdone, let a purple aura enshroud him and expanded upwards into the form of a giant armored figure. WOOOOOOWWWWHHHH. The males in the audience exclaimed in awe. Even with the serious scene, much like with the picture of Kagutsuchi, the boys had reverted to their basic instincts at the sight of a magic Gundam. The ladies, except Talia and Quetzalcoatl, who were gawking with the boys, just shook their heads in disappointment at the childishness, even if the sight of the glowing warrior was amazing. As the ethereal warrior raised a giant glowing sword and braced itself for the oncoming fight, Sasuke screamed the name of his technique. Susanoo. Amaterasu blinked as the man called out the name of her blood brother. That's so cool. Nico and Percy both had stars in their eyes at the sight of the technique. I need to learn how to do that. Apollo was just as excited as the kids and jumping up and down in his seat, while his sister rolled her eyes at him. Please. As if we need you to be a bigger eyesore, the huntress smirked. while low-fiving her lieutenant at the clever quip. Her brother pouted, "That's mean, Artie." He then smirked, "You don't see me talking that way about your chariot." "And what's wrong with my chariot?" Infuriatingly, her brother smirked at her, "Oh, just, everything." The twins devolved into bickering among themselves, much to everyone else's annoyance or amusement. The beginning of the end? The end? Could this be the mass extinction event mentioned in the beginning? The one that ended the old world? Athena wondered, drawing a gasp from the Titaness as she came to a similar conclusion. That must mean they're fighting Mother. I knew the woman felt familiar. Rhea got up from her seat and looked at the screen in worry. Her children, especially the big three, looked at the screen with mild apprehension as well. Wait. Something isn't right, Hermes pointed out. If Great Granny could do this all along, then why didn't she just do it in the Gigantomachy? Why bother creating children and stretching out a war for years if she could, come out herself and wipe the slate clean? Although the god of messengers made a valid point, many felt displeased by it. The thought that they somehow got off easy during one of their two major historical conflicts was not a pleasant thing to think about. She can do it, the Titaness affirmed, making her children narrow their eyes, or she should be at least. I've grown up feeling her raw power, but for some reason it always felt chained or restricted somehow. Her words brought an uneasy silence as everyone digested the information. Annabeth raised a hand nervously, but at her mother's nod of encouragement, she gulped and spoke up. I believe it's one of two scenarios. Either Gaia was restricted by an outside force, that being either the sage or something else, or she felt another apocalypse was not warranted. That's a very good observation. Annabeth Chase, the goddess of the moon, who'd been silent for a while, agreed with the demi-goddess. While I was never as active as Pan, she didn't notice Hermes flinch at his son's name. When it came to observing Earth's environment, the damage done to Gaia's body in the last century alone is unprecedented. We've even feared she might awaken during the Second World War, the goddess pondered. Her wise sister nodded in support, and then with a look of realization, turned to the two foreign goddesses, who looked just as apprehensive as the rest of them at the moment. Lady Amaterasu, Lady Ketz, it's Qatsi, Mirta. The goddess of wisdom paused, annoyed at the interruption but still nodded hesitantly before resuming. As I was saying, Lady Amaterasu, Qatsi, may I ask if you have any additional information to provide on the subject? Athena asked, noticing quickly how both goddesses gained an uneasy look and glanced at each other. Seemingly communicating something silently, Amaterasu turned to the audience and cleared her throat. While Papa and his siblings always kept a lot of the details close to their chest, our uncle Isobu once mentioned that Papa had done something to Kaguya, or Gaia as you call her. And that something is? The king of Olympus pressed, even leaning forward in his throne. With another silent exchange of looks, this time Quetzalcoatl spoke up, no to Nemo's idea. At the look she received, she shrugged and elaborated, Tio didn't know either. Pepito likely never told them. From what they said, they were put to sleep at the time. Are you lying? Zeus' accusation was cut off as Amaterasu immediately sprung from her seat to face him in anger. Do not accuse my sister of anything, Baka ou. The king balked at the insult while his brothers snickered, and made to get up as well. How dare you? Before the situation could escalate, a pair of fiery hands clasped both the Shinto and Greek leaders' shoulders and forced them back down to their seats. Both of you calm down. Hestia yelled out, her eyes glowing. Let's not be rash and accuse anyone of anything. She turned to her brother, and Zeus, be patient. It's likely the book will tell us what happened if it's showing us the sage's memories. The king looked at his sister, then at his mother who shook her head at his behavior, before huffing and crossing his arms. Just keep reading then. Above Pennsylvania, 5th of August 2000. That's strange, the goddess of the moon muttered to herself as she rode her chariot in the night sky. Artemis sniffed at her brother haughtily as if to express how better her ride was than his. Amaterasu and Quetzalcoatl smiled softly. It reminded them of their respective childhoods when their father took them both flying. It was a marvelous bonding experience, even if Zetsu was always grouchy about it. While it was essentially her job, Artemis would never deny how much she loved it. Flying above the clouds and under the many stars that dotted the sky, feeling the chilled breeze caress her skin and run through her hair and having one of the best views of the earth below her. Hear, hear, the god of the sun voiced his agreement. Sure, some people, like her little brother, would argue that the world looked better in the day, but she scoffed and turned her nose up at those comments. I agree with my lady as well. The few times I've had to ride your chariot at night were delightful, Zoe commented, having remained silent up until now. Her compliment earned her a smile from Artemis. Maybe I should take a page out of brother's book and turn the chariot into a bus. I could give my girls a nice ride through the night sky, the huntress pondered, thinking of ways to reward her group, as they had been working hard lately. The world beneath her looked much like the sky, dotted with numerous lights from mortal towns and cities. However, unlike some megalopolises like New York were more bothersome due to the intense light pollution that made both the sky and the ground hard to admire, the countryside was a far more relaxing sight to look at during the night. This was one of the reasons she'd accepted a recent request from her favorite sister. Keeping an eye out on Athena's child was of no issue to her, especially when the child in question was an adorable little girl. No one can resist Tine Beth. Talia jokingly pinched her surrogate little sister's cheek while the girl blushed and batted her away. Thal's, stoop, the blonde demi-goddess groaned, while her friends chuckled at her. Rhea mentally squealed at the scene. Her grandbabies were so cute. The two Olympian sisters smiled at each other. From her vantage point, everything below seemed relatively microscopic. It should be impossible for anyone to distinguish anyone from this distance. Even among the gods, Artemis' eyesight, alongside her other senses, was only rivaled by her twin brother. "We're doing the ultimate Where's Waldo tournament after this," Apollo challenged his sister. "HMPH, you'd lose, little brother, just like you do in our archery contests," the huntress huffed with a smirk. "Oh yeah? Wanna bet on that, lil' sis?" The sun god grinned back. "I told you countless times, I'm the oldest." Unseen to both of them, Hermes took out his phone and started making preparations to collect bets. Bookmarking was a side hustle, but in a place filled with all-powerful residents like Olympus, things tended to get boring. And when boredom strikes and challenges start being thrown around, it was up to the god of hustling to bank on the occasion. His Nana and Super Gramps were corrupting him. After sensing the group she was shadowing, her silver eyes glowed and immediately formed a close image of the 5 individuals, much like a hawk picking out a field mouse. What she saw was relatively normal for the 5 travelers. The 3 demigods were behaving much like regular children their age. The man Naruto was as obnoxiously jovial as ever, almost reaching Apollo levels of annoying. "Peefed, if you think Pepito's annoying, you've never met Gekka when he's preparing for un evento," the Aztec scoffed. The Shinto god of love and marriage always badgered her about proper dress codes and useless Mirta-like fashion or whatnot before any major events. It was even worse when her aunt Matabi and Chang'e joined him. Amaterasu rolled her eyes, but didn't disagree, although she felt the title of most annoying would more likely go to one of her blood brothers. She'd take her father's jovial personality any day over her Tsukuyomi or Susanoo's antics. One was a creepy bro-con who failed to hide it, while the other was a drunken pervert who spent his time looking for ways to peep on her female subordinates. She'd include Kagutsuchi too, but her twin had done too much for her in his long life, and there was no denying that, except for their janitorial services who always had to clean up behind him. Most of Takamagahara and Oreguk's population loved him and his inventions. And yet, something seemed off about them. Their actions were a tad stiff. The man's laughter seemed a tad forced, and even little Annabeth's cheerful actions seemed a tad repetitive. The changes wouldn't be visible to anyone else. Someone might even say there were none. But her instincts, honed from millennia of tracking and hunting prey, of learning and memorizing each and every behavioral tick they possessed, were nagging at her. Curiously enough, only the son Zetsu, as she had learned, was consistent in his behavior. Artemis, Athena and Zeus narrowed their eyes as one as they digested the information. "You think he could be, but that's impossible. I mean, he was holding a strand of the kid's hair last chapter, so maybe." Both Amaterasu and Quetzalcoatl bit their lips to stop a grin from forming. It wouldn't do to have their big bro's scheme come to light so quickly. It was always hilarious when Zetsu pulled a fast one on others like that. Additionally, their route had deviated ever so slightly from the one they had been on previously. While Artemis doubted that they knew the exact location of the camp, she would wager they had a general idea of its whereabouts. In that case, they would have kept close to the east coast, which had been the case up until a few weeks ago. So then why was she seeing them near Harrisburg? That was further inland than before. "This is nonsensical," the huntress muttered. "My lady? Surely he couldn't have thrown you on a false track," Zoe whispered to her patron, looking a tad worried herself. Zoe had been around the block long enough to know that Artemis was unchallenged when it came to tracking someone. To see another version of herself be fooled by something as basic as a decoy was unsettling. It must have something to do with that other technique he mentioned in the last chapter. Apollo rubbed his chin thoughtfully, then looked at his sister teasingly. "What was its name again, sis?" Artemis glared at him. "Peeping Tom, begone." "Hey," Hephaestus snorted to himself as he said the name. It was childish but so on point. Maybe he should start naming some of the stuff his family ordered the same way. It would be funny to have an embarrassed Athena ask for a people poker when she comes to pick up her spear. It didn't make any sense. Unless, no, convoluted conspiracies were her sister's territory. Athena raised a brow at her sister, who smiled teasingly at her. Speaking of Athena, it has been a while since she'd had a cup of nectar with her. Well, couldn't hurt to tell her about this development. Oh, she's gonna freak out. Apollo rubbed his hands eagerly as he and Hermes snickered. Campfire near Harrisburg, same time, Z5, you're overdoing it. I need 50% less attitude. Grace might act tough but she ain't a Yakuza grunt. Z4, less broody, more sassy. Castellan ain't one of Tsukuyomi's kids. Z6, you're actually doing good. Keep it up. Z7, I know we all hate the jokes but try to make some shittier ones. The last few were too good for the old man's standards, the figure of Zetsu's human form thought as he looked at the other people with him. What? Everyone was surprised when Artemis, uncharacteristically, was the one to jump and stand on her throne, pointing at the screen in outrage. My lady, please calm down. No, Zoe. I will not be made a fool in my own field of expertise. Before any of the Olympians' closer relatives could intervene to calm her down, assistance came from an unlikely source. Don't feel bad, chica. Quetzalcoatl looked at the angered goddess in what might have passed for a sympathetic gaze, but was contradicted by the grin she sported. Zizi Hermano is just that guy. She shrugged then looked to the side darkly. Be thankful he didn't put curse-stitching powder in your calzones. Amaterasu shivered, or some of his magic seeds in your food. Susanoo had to have a growing tree surgically removed from his stomach at the time. Part of Amaterasu had been horrified at the brutal punishment while another part was grateful as it had occurred after the god tried to peek into her private onsen. The huntress suddenly felt like her other had gotten off easy. Got it. Z3. To any outside observer, like a certain moon goddess. The moon goddess in question grumbled. The scene around the fire was an ordinary one. A whiskered adult blonde male looked over the smaller teenagers and children around him as they all sat down for a relatively normal night of camping. But as the other four campers around the fire all shifted their body language slightly, each adjusting to the advice given to them, it revealed a far more eerie reality. None of the campers present were real people. Not real? Are they illusions? Bianca wondered. Between Quetzalcoatl telling them her brother could duplicate himself, the hair strands, and Zetsu's ability to shapeshift, it was a foregone conclusion. An illusion would not be enough to fool my lady, Zoe denied, having heard the ex-huntress's comment. This is weird. Talia grimaced as she looked at the scene. The guy had even copied her freckles too, talk about creepy. I always wondered what my clone would look like but this, Annabeth shuddered while Percy raised a brow at her admission. Oh, like you haven't thought about it, seaweed brain. Well, René Descartes' first philosophical principle of, I think, therefore I am, might have applied to them, as each possessed their individual thoughts and mannerisms, but the blunt truth of the matter was that each of them was a clone of the original Zetsu, a mere extension of his will. Both Annabeth and Athena nodded. While the goddess didn't dabble in philosophy as much as the other fields of the mind, it was still a field that shaped human history. Despite their misgivings about their situation or their desire for a destiny separate from the original, it was simply not to be. The biological failsafe coded into their very lineage factor ensured as such, AAAND prevented the possibility of another reign of Zetsu's incident. The what incident? Zeus squawked, alarmed at this. He turned to Amaterasu, who decidedly looked away with an innocent look on her face, much to her sister and Ray's amusement. Oh, this just got interesting, Hades mused, smirking to himself. That both sounded like something he would do, and watch out for. I'm starting to like the little guy if he keeps giving our dear brother scares like that. Poseidon chuckled from his side, receiving a glare from Zeus. I'm curious as well, as I cannot recall any mention of such an incident in recorded history, the goddess of wisdom commented, looking at the foreigners, Lady Amaterasu, and Quatsi. Would you like to elaborate on it? The Shinto and Aztec deities looked at one another and shrugged. Nope, both said at the same time. The king narrowed his eyes, but before he could make another scene, his mother sighed. Honestly, Sparky, you shouldn't be so charged at every little thing. The Titaness placated her son then turned to the sage's daughters. Now you too. While my son tries to ground himself, could you, at the very least, please explain if the incident was dangerous or not? While the Titaness puns were atrocious and garnered enough groans from the audience, her request got the two foreign deities to think. Once again, both sisters exchanged a look with one another, silently communicating on the issue, before Amaterasu turned and shrugged. I mean it wasn't lethally dangerous, she began. See. No one died, her sister added, before whispering, lots of people got beat up though, and Pepito broke out his cinturon, she shivered. That's all we're saying though, the Shinto hurriedly finished with a strained smile as she and her sister bumped fists, much to the king's irritation. Zeus wanted to object more, but one look from his sister, mother and wife got him to clam up and cross his arms like a child. He wasn't used to being denied. HMPH. Not that the clones wanted it to happen again, but they wouldn't try too hard to stop themselves if it came down to it. Once again, Zeus threw a dangerous look at the two sisters who gave him a matching pair of smirks. Welp, that's not foreboding at all, Dionysus shrugged. In his opinion, if the incident wasn't that dangerous, there was no harm in letting it happen. It might shake things up a bit, but in any case, their current mission was an easy one, albeit dreadfully boring. Z1 had opted to have Z3 to Z7 play decoys and take away their pursuers' attention, while Z2 would infiltrate the Olympian stronghold and wring it dry for information. And I'm curious as to how he'll pull it off. Hades and Poseidon were both smirking at a frowning Zeus and Athena. The issue lied with Z2. While the other clones knew Olympus was originally a mountain in Greece, they had no idea if the gods had kept the original mountain as their home, or created a bigger replica to inhabit. Annabeth glanced at her mother in curiosity, and the latter simply pointed upwards, giving the girl her answer. Even then, a heavily guarded and populated mountain was still a significant surface to cover for one clone, especially if they had to remain unseen. That meant the need for greater numbers, and while shadow clones could help with recon, they were also expensive in terms of chakra consumption. Many of the audience, especially the Olympians involved in managing security, were feeling more invested. The information Zetsu was saying could help them immensely with counterintelligence. Even Zeus, although still angry at the thought of being slighted like so, could see the benefit in that information. Thus, Z2 needed to consume the necessary biomass to multiply, without getting caught. For some reason, Demeter felt a chill go down her spine. Which, depending on Olympus' level of security, could be either manageable or downright tedious. He'd assume it would be the latter. While the Taoists back in the day did have the rat zodiac's ability to share vision with every living creature in an immense radius, this land had both advanced leaps and bounds in technology and was renowned for its espionage agency. That's a hell of a broken ability. Apollo blinked in surprise. Sure, some of the Olympians could pull off similar tricks, but Zetsu made it sound like the Taoist being had a security setup in their mind and could do it simultaneously. That level of concentration could only be rivaled by Athena herself. Like you're one to talk, Hermes rolled his eyes. He'd always envied his brother's ability to see everything touched by the rays of his chariot, even if the god couldn't watch everything at the same time. It made pulling off pranks and heists all the more tedious. Percy raised a hand. Is Zetsu talking about the FBI? He asked, only to be nudged by Talia. FBI's is like the super police. The CIA are the spies, kelphead. Even I know that. The demi-goddess smirked at her cousin, who gave her a dry look. Thanks, Pinecone Face. Z3 assumed these two factors would translate into a much more challenging infiltration mission for his senior clone. Hell, that wasn't even counting Olympus was only one of the Greek strongholds. If Atlantis or the underworld were anywhere near the size of that mountain, then Z2 had his work cut out for him if he wanted to map those places as well. Here, Hades paused and looked at Seafaring Brother. Both seemed to be thinking about the same thing. Much as they enjoyed the Uzumaki family's antics, that didn't mean they wanted the younger one snooping in their backyard. Either the Zetsu overconfident in himself, or he's the real deal, the god of the underworld muttered, feeling a mix of apprehension and excitement at the prospect. Someone with similar abilities in stealth as himself and his helm was a rarity. This presented a challenge to him, and it had been a while since the underworld faced any significant threat. This could be a change from all the paperwork he had to do downstairs. Maybe he and Thanatos could stretch their legs a bit. Especially the underworld. If there was anything they learned about warfare with a pantheon in the past, it was the necessity of targeting, disabling or outright destroying their underworld first and foremost. The two foreigners shrugged their shoulders while Rhea frowned. She did not like where Zetsu was going with this. Maybe so, but Olympus remains the most important piece on the board. The god of the sky crossed his arms and huffed in indignation. Hades rolled his eyes at his brother, while internally feeling a smidge, just a smidge flattered over being considered more dangerous than the entirety of Olympus. That, or sick Lord Shinigami on their death gods, if another Yama situation came to be. The old spirit would certainly enjoy the meal. Hades blinked and reread the line again to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. He then turned to the two daughters of the sage with an incredulous and slightly apprehensive expression on his face. His children, despite not knowing their father all that well, bore the same expressions of worry. Alright, what in Tartarus did Zetsu mean? Like Hades, everyone turned to the foreign sisters. This time when Amaterasu and Quetzalcoatl tried to escape the interrogation, they were shut down by the last person they expected. No, Rhea shook her head. Sorry sweeties, but you are not postponing this one. Not if it has anything to do with my baby's health. So spill, the Titaness commanded the two. The Shinto and Aztec deities looked at each other and evaluated the situation. Should they run, or fight, or just give in? The first two options were a no-go for obvious reasons. It would cause trouble for everyone and end in an interpantheonic disaster. So that left, look, it's not that we don't want to talk about it in detail, it's that even if we tell you, there's not much Qualquiera can do about it, Quetzalcoatl started, crossing her arms and standing defiantly in the face of the Olympians. To their credit, the Greeks remained calm. Why? Spoke the god of the underworld, his face set in stone. This time, Amaterasu spoke. Lord Shinigami is extremely powerful, to the point no one, not even Papa or our uncles and aunts can put a stop to him, but that doesn't mean they need to either, since he acts by an unbreakable set of rules. Her statement only served to heighten the tension in the room. Ever curious and gaining a lot more courage, it was the daughter of Athena who asked the next question. But Lady Amaterasu, isn't the Shinigami part of the Shinto pantheon? The blonde had her notebook up, both eager and worried about the information she might receive, which got her a smile from her mother. The raven-haired deity shook her head. It doesn't work like that. The Shinigami is only really affiliated to us by coincidence and because he happens to have some kind of liaison with Papa, she explained, then took a deep breath. The Shinigami is old. Much older than anyone on Earth and among the spirits inhabiting it. You could say he was the first of his kind, and according to what Papa told us before, the Uzumaki clan of the old world had connections to him as well. Looking at everyone, she continued. Big Bro might have mentioned it offhandedly here, but the Yama situation, as he put it, was a very complex issue that resulted in drastic measures being taken by both Papa and the Shinigami. It's not something that happens commonly or even rarely. The explanation served to relieve some of the tension, but many in the audience were still curious. The Queen, now seeing a potential threat to Olympus as well, but willing to give the two foreigners the benefit of the doubt, decided to follow up. Assuming what you say about the Shinigami's unstoppable nature is true, I believe what everyone wishes to know now is the motive behind his actions, so that we may take steps to avoid a potential confrontation. Hera phrased her question carefully, making sure it didn't come off as an attempt to run from a stronger enemy. Before the Shinto deity could reply, her sister, who had become increasingly annoyed with the interrogation, got up and pointed at the god of the underworld. Look. As long as Rostro Polito here, Hades frowns at the nickname while his brothers snicker, doesn't do something like force a cycle of reincarnation, usher an apocalypsis, or play with souls like Masa, there's nada to be worried about. She crossed her arms and huffed. Now can we get back to the reading? I'm bored. Hear, hear. Aries voiced his support for his crush. In a moment, Hera snapped at her son, then turned back to the daughters of the sage. So from what you said, we can assume this Yama fellow committed one of those crimes? Amaterasu nodded hesitantly. More than a few. Back in the Heavenly War, the Jade Emperor needed more troops to face Papa and his siblings. Plus, since Big Bro could clone himself endlessly with enough biomass, the Taoists needed a way to even the scales. So Okwang had his brother Yama essentially hijack the Taoist cycle of reincarnation and force souls to resurrect immediately after they died into the bodies of their own soldiers. She trailed off, seeing the mounting horror on some of the Olympians' faces. Creating an army that automatically and endlessly replenished itself, Athena finished, a look of understanding on her face. Those poor souls, Hestia gasped, hands covering her mouth. Hades likewise looked on in disgust. If this was true, then this, Yama, had gone to forbidden territories that even Tartarus, to his knowledge, hadn't ventured into. Silence enveloped the room as everyone mulled over what they just learned. It was an expected reaction. Yama, the king of Du, the Taoist underworld, was, according to her father, right up there with beings like Mara, Okwang or Jashin in terms of sheer heinousness. While much of his actions could be blamed on both his brother and another entity she really didn't want to think about at the moment, the mad god had still put her father through years of pain during the war. The whole story of that battle had made her weep for her father back when she first learned about it after the war. It was still something she felt horrible about even today, as her father still suffered the effects of those painful years. She didn't care if people called her a daddy's girl or overbearing. She nagged at her siblings because she didn't wish to put any more pressure on her papa. He had taken her in when no one wanted to and raised her into the queen she was today. Caring for his mental health and safety was the least she could do. She appreciated the Olympians had the decency to recognize Yama for the monster that he was. "Sue, how tough was this Yama guy?" Aries asked while cleaning his ear with his pinky. Or most of them at least. Her sister wasn't any better. She had to shut the blonde deity down with a look before the adrenaline junkie started babbling about that fight. "Maybe we can leave this for later? Dear?" Rhea answered the god, a dangerous edge in her voice, as she had picked up on Amaterasu's emotions. The god pouted alongside his crush who had been eager to talk shop. Decisions for later. It might seem pragmatic of him, but the clone had no doubt that, while no one wanted to start anything, both the original and the sage would rather be prepared for a full-out war than be caught off guard. A wise king never seeks out war, but he must always be ready for it. The quote came, surprisingly, from Zeus, who looked like he swallowed a lemon. It was hard for him to admit, but he could see the little gremlin's reasoning. Didn't mean he had to like it though. While he and his Norse counterpart had their differences, the Greek could admit Odin had some nifty quotes to stay ahem borrow. But no matter. For now, Z3 would play his part. Olympus, Athena's temple. Later that night, a temple was and always has been both a monument to the deity's glory and a reflection of their influence. It was a place of communion for the worshippers, one where they could feel safe and protected in faith. It stood to logic that the gods' residences on Olympus would apply this principle. Said gods nodded. The demigods looked at each other. The cabins back at camp were the same. Is it the same with you, Lady Amaterasu? Quatsi? Hestia felt curious enough to ask. The Shinto goddess nodded. Ain't got one, but the Amazon still has some sweet lugares de reunion, the Aztec goddess shrugged. Ever since the fading of her pantheon, their equivalent of Olympus had also disappeared. Not that she ever lived there anyway, she'd take roughing it in the jungle or a nap on a cloud over a stuffy temple any day. In Athena's case, hers looked like a grander version of Harvard University's library, one built in flawlessly carved white marble and surrounded by an English garden, although it looked to be the size of a park. Annabeth had stars in her eyes, while her friends, and even Luke, chuckled at her enthusiasm. Hey, that's like Tio Isobu's underwater library. Quetzalcoatl pointed at the screen. The building was big just like her reclusive uncle's, and while she didn't visit it much because books were not her thing, swimming around there with the kappas was nice and relaxing. Athena blinked at the ludicrous statement. An underwater library? There must have been charms in place to protect the books. Or maybe that Oreguk place didn't use traditional paper? More questions to be answered. Unlike many of the Olympians' homes, the wisdom goddess opened part of her home to the public, with a section of the library containing copies of all the knowledge that the goddess had seen fit to share with others. Hearing that, the daughter of wisdom turned to her mother with a pleading look. One that garnered a smile from Athena and a nod of approval. Yes. Annabeth threw her hands up in excitement. Classic wise girl. Percy teased her and earned himself a blush and a nudge from the blonde, while Talia, and Luke, though he tried to hide it, looked on with soft smiles at the heartwarming sight. As Artemis came before her sister's home in her adult form, her silver eyes spotted the handmaidens taking care of the garden or the entryway, while other citizens sat around on benches or under the many trees that peppered Athena's garden, each with a book in hand. Bah! They should be fighting. Ares groaned. He was still pissed about Hera and Hestia closing his arena to the public, after getting on his case about killing his opponents there. Or fucking, Aphrodite silently muttered and pouted. She was also sore about her brothel project being shut down decades ago by several of the Olympians. Hestia gave the two lovers the stink eye. Upon noticing her, many stopped their activities and turned to bow towards her as she passed by. It's like the Sakura Gardens in Takamagahara, Amaterasu nudged her sister. Or Teokokuo's parks, Quetzalcoatl remembered all the wonderful naps she got there. Both Hestia, Rhea and even Demeter felt interested in the locations. Maybe if everything worked out well, they could end up visiting them? The latter of the three was more. It made the goddess of the moon smile at the peaceful atmosphere. While many of their family used their name and power to spread their influence for selfish reasons, her sister was among the few who genuinely cared for the betterment of her subjects and followers. This in turn garnered her far more respect and reverence among the mortals. Where Artemis was admired by young women and hunters of all ages, every Occidental intellectual worth their salt knew and had a high opinion of the goddess of wisdom. Amaterasu's opinion of the goddess likewise rose. Her uncle Isobu was the same way despite his silent and introverted nature. As she approached the entrance, the large marble doors swung open to allow her entry. As soon as she stepped in, the distinct sound of fluttering paper reached her ears and guided her through the main hallway up to the last, larger, and fancier door at the end of the path. Annabeth's eyes were taking in the sights of her mother's temple. She couldn't wait to step foot in there. As she approached, the doors swung open as a disheveled and frantic-looking handmaiden clambered out. The woman balked in surprise at the sight of the huntress in front of her and almost dropped the stack of papers she was carrying if it weren't for the goddess' swift intervention. The goddess of love inspected the girl on the screen. She's pretty cute. Such a shame she's being overworked by a slave driver. Her dig at Athena earned an owl-like squawk from the goddess of wisdom. I will shave you bald, harlot. Ooh, will that be before, or after you finish whipping your SLA ahem employees? As much as Artemis would have loved to help her sister throttle the impertinent love goddess, one look from Hestia had her restraining the enraged goddess. LL Lady AA Artemis, The servant stuttered in shock and shame at having committed such a faux pas in front of an Olympian, the favored relative of her mistress no less. Hestia shook her head in disappointment. Athena dear, I can understand getting carried away in your own projects, but you shouldn't drag your poor subjects into it. The goddess of wisdom was decent enough to recognize the truth in that statement, even if her hubris wouldn't let her admit it out loud. After all, her handmaidens were selected for their diligence and intelligence. While keeping up with her was something she wished for, it was understandable why they, even as immortals, could not. Zeus crossed his arms. He refused to admonish his daughter even if he did secretly agree. Artemis frowned lightly at the servant's earnest attempts at apologizing and her jittery disposition. She looked physically and mentally fatigued. The huntress nodded in acceptance and helped the woman straighten her attire, while telekinetically moving the heavy stack of paper from her hands to the side. Athena threw her sister a look of gratitude which the huntress accepted with a nod and a smile. Calm yourself. The goddess smiled disarmingly and it seemed to work, as the woman's shoulders sagged in relief. I wish to thank you for your hard work. I understand my sister demands much but am happy to see she has such loyal followers. Please, take the rest of the day off, I'll talk to my sister. The handmaiden nodded hesitantly, seemingly reluctant about abandoning her previous orders, but she knew better than to go against an Olympian to their face. So, her lips curved into a grateful smile as she bowed once more and walked away. Athena mentally took note of the handmaiden, and reminded herself to give her and some of the more diligent ones some time off. Artemis glanced at the stack of papers and sifted through them, noticing they were all written in foreign languages, most notably Japanese and Korean among others from the East. Apollo squinted at the image in interest, trying to read some of the papers that briefly appeared. He read a few words from one, then raised an eyebrow and turned to his smarter sister. Why do you have the first recipe for mooncakes? Athena shrugged. It was written by the same scribe that first recorded the story of Chang'e. I felt it would provide insight into the Zhou dynasty, the goddess explained, much to her daughter's interest. Plus, there is a folk tale about the overthrow of the Yuan dynasty being facilitated by messages smuggled in mooncakes, she finished. Percy grimaced. That must have tasted awful. Annabeth smacked her forehead and groaned, seaweed brain. The son of the sea shrugged. What? Who wants paper in their cake? Maybe Grover, Talia answered with a smile as her surrogate sister groaned again. Percy nodded. Yup, the G-man would love him. Then he blinked. Hey, if Grover eats pie filling in a can, does that count as a metal pie? Talia opened her mouth to answer, before looking pensive. Bianca shook her head. The workings of your mind are strange, cousin, she admitted with a fond smile, while the blonde demi-goddess nodded in agreement. The boy didn't look offended. I'll take it as a compliment, thanks cuz. Hestia, Rhea and even Amaterasu perked up as the conversation about mooncakes stretched on. The Greeks were cooks by nature and the Shinto remembered her friend Chang'e, who also happened to be the best mooncake baker, ever. Titanus clapped her hands. Oh, I can't wait to try those. I'll make sure they're, she turned to the Shinto goddess with a wink, out of this world. Said foreign deity grabbed her head in pain. The cringe, it was too strong. Hades decided to be merciful for once and resume reading to save the audience from the mom jokes. Curious about her sister's work, the goddess of the moon pushed open the door and went in to confront her, only to stop at the entrance of Athena's central office. Books, documents, and papers of all sorts flew around the room, one the size of a small football field, as they were stacked, picked, and handled by the multitude of handmaidens running around, pushing stacked trolleys and carrying sacks of scrolls. To Artemis, it reminded her of an average day in Hermes' temple. My, Athena honey, aren't you a busy bee? Your temple is positively buzzing with activity. Grandmother please, the goddess in question flushed gold from the Titanus jab. Hoo, average? That's a slow day back at the crib. The god of messengers laughed out. Luke, despite himself, felt curious. He's always assumed the reason his father never picked up the phone was purely to avoid him and his mother. But from what he's been learning lately, there's likely a much deeper reason for it. Aside from his job, which he's been realizing was very much among the most time-consuming on the planet, Hermes' earlier reaction when it came to his mother and both Apollo's and Zeus' involvements made him ponder. While he still held the same amount of resentment as before, the current reading was also giving him the opportunity to get a closer look at the Olympians and compare what he's seen today with both his own past experiences and whatever Kronos had whispered in his ears. Add to that Rhea and Hestia's constant doting and his barriers were slowly breaking down. He'll keep silent for now as he was still unwilling to face his former friends properly. But maybe soon, it would have been comical had it not been for the noticeable signs of fatigue she could pick out on the servants' faces. They had obviously been at this job for hours longer than usual. Both Hestia and Rhea shook their heads in disappointment while Athena hid her face in shame. Aphrodite had a smirk on her pretty face, feeling like she had hit the nail on the head with her earlier teasing. At least the boys and girls under her employ got to enjoy benefits from their servitude. Maybe she could lure the sage in with a harem of maids? That particular kink has been getting a sharp rise in recent years, especially if what she heard from Apollo about Japan's maid cafes was real. At the center of all the organized chaos was the goddess of wisdom. Clad in an attire reminiscent of a librarian, both comfortable and professional, the deity's heels clacked as she paced around her desk, simultaneously reading a book while other documents floated around her, all being analyzed and treated at inhuman speed. The goddess of love scrunched her nose up at the drab, in her opinion, attire. Honestly, Athena, if it's not enough you have to subject your servants to hard labor, do you have to expose them to your fashion faux pas as well? The goddess of wisdom sharpened her spear a bit harder in response as she glared murderously at the fashionista. We can't all dress like street workers in front of our subordinates, Artemis chimed in her sister's defense. Aphrodite turned a sharp glare at her rival. Hestia sighed as she saw the two goddesses begin to bicker. At least Athena was expressing more restraint than before. Her gray eyes glowed intensely as they took in information at a faster pace than anyone on Olympus could keep up with. A sight that would leave mortals and minor gods in awe, however, only made the huntress frown. Despite how she looked, Artemis knew Athena was overworked. Her sister had the tendency to put up an almost impeccable front, but the minute twitches on her face, the fact a few strands of her black hair stood stubbornly outside of the otherwise well-coiffed bun, and of course, the state in which she found her servants, all of this pointed to the goddess of wisdom slowly being overwhelmed by whatever was occupying her. You were always easy to read, sister. Artemis turned from her spat with Aphrodite to smile smugly at her sister. Athena, although still visibly angered, sighed in acceptance at her siblings' teasing. But of course, Athena couldn't show weakness, she couldn't take her time, she couldn't let go of her Zeus-damn hubris for 1 second. Poseidon mockingly shook his head at the goddess, eliciting another glare from her. Both Percy and Annabeth, seeing the interaction, looked at each other and sighed. Honestly, why couldn't their parents just tolerate each other? Damn it, sister. The goddess of the moon stopped before her sister and frowned at her. Is this a bad time? She asked, making the wiser sibling pause in her work. Without looking up from her documents, Athena uttered a simple yes before going back to her reading. Short and straight to the point. I like it, Hephaestus huffed in amusement. He did the same whenever he was busy with a project. Artemis sighed in annoyance, before gaining a determined look. Turning her back on her sister, the huntress went to each servant and whispered to them, taking their workloads off their backs and promptly sending them away. While many were noticeably hesitant, one glance at her cold silver eyes forced them to comply. Damn Artie. Usurping Athena's authority. How could you? Apollo and Hermes giggled like children as they poked fun at the two sisters. Artemis and a spear-sharpening Athena looked at one another and nodded in silent agreement. They would get the two later. Can you children stop antagonizing one another? At this rate we'll end up tussling one another before the chapter ends. Hestia looked at the more immature gods, annoyance clear on her features. She was getting sick of constantly restraining and admonishing them. She was sure her mother was as well. Ooh, can we? The Aztec instinctively reacted to the mention of a possible fight. What she said, Ares added, his hunger for violence resurfacing. Children. This time, Rhea got up to admonish them, her heeled sandal already in hand. The two deities promptly hid behind the nearest person. Athena didn't seem to notice this, too absorbed in her work to see that the entire room, save for the two sisters, had been vacated. Tisk. Artemis shook her head once again in faux disappointment. Even Zoe began chuckling at her lady's antics. Seeing this, the goddess of the moon closed the doors and turned to her sister. She got in her face and swiftly pulled the book away from the goddess of wisdom. Naturally, the studious goddess didn't take that kindly. Her gray eyes turned in anger and annoyance at the perpetrator, only to meet her sister's silver orbs. Athena opened her mouth to speak, but as her sister raised a brow at her, she decided otherwise and sighed in exasperation. Yeesh, had it been anyone else, that would have been a death sentence, Apollo winced. His sister could be brutal when interrupted. You're telling me? Hermes raised his hands in exasperation. She once threw a spear at me for ringing the front bell too loudly. And as for moi, Aphrodite added, she once ruined my makeup for calling her during one of her classes. The goddess pouted and did her best to look innocent. Hestia, hearing these accusations, turned to her niece with an inquiring look, wordlessly asking her to explain. The goddess of wisdom groaned and promised herself to add Aphrodite to her and her sister's future hunt. Maybe they'll get her girls involved and make it a group activity too. Seal the three's magic and send them running into a forest. They could use the stress relief. What is it, sister? Can't you see I'm busy? Athena spoke with annoyance. Honestly, Hestia looked disappointed. When did you and Artemis get so rude with others? The goddess of the hearth turned to the two sisters, who suddenly looked worried. We'll have to remedy that. The goddess of family promised and turned to the queen, Hera. How about you and Demeter join me for some tea later on? I fear the rest of the gods might forget their manner if we don't remind them. The elder Olympian sisters looked at each other and shrugged. While Demeter would rather gossip with her sisters, disciplining younger gods was right up Hera's alley. It could be a fun family bonding activity. Artemis and Athena started sweating. That's one way to put it. Artemis raised a brow at her sister's attitude but chose not to comment on it. What's on that vast mind of yours, Athena? While the affectionate nickname might have triggered a violent reaction from anyone else, Athena and Artemis' sisterly bond made it so both enjoyed occasionally teasing the other, much like regular mortal siblings. The two sisters shared a smile with one another. Below with the foreigners, Quetzalcoatl poked her sister in the ribs, in a place she knew Amaterasu was sensitive. Like us, hermana? The goddess of the sun recoiled from the contact, her body reacting to the ticklish sensation. Stop it, Quatsi. The Aztec was undeterred, and barraged her sister with pokes while the Shinto tried to block or dodge them. After a few minutes, veins began appearing all over Amaterasu's neck and face as she went into Yakuza mode. I said stop, ya brat. As if to prove the book's earlier point, the two deities once again started roughhousing like children. The demigods looked at the sight of the two. All of them, including Luke, were getting much too used to the two supposedly divine beings, acting like regular siblings. It created a sharp contrast with the Olympians. Zeus groaned, "This is why I stopped having godly children." Hera gave him a look, before refilling her chalice with nectar and taking a deep gulp. "I'm sure, husband." Those two, Hestia sighed in exasperation with a hint of fondness. While on the bright side, this meant the two sisters were closer to one another than most of the Greek deities were with each other. It still felt like she had to put the two on a leash like many of those mortal mothers did nowadays. How did the sage handle them? Rhea tittered at the sight. Hoo. Ah well, while a fight between siblings might be dangerous, I do believe in this case it's very. She looked at her daughter with a wink. Relative. Mother. Hoo. Athena sighed to herself. It's the usual, pre-scheduling the preparations for this year's winter solstice, checking the new quests and potential prophecies with your brother, mapping out this week's events, rechecking the security system, inputting. The smartest goddess on Olympus rambled on, before her sister chose to cut her off. What was that about security? Didn't you already do the weekly checkup? Artemis narrowed her eyes at the detail. Yes, but someone smuggled a super spy in their sandal, Apollo yelled out. Artemis and Zoe snarled back at the god, but the huntress expression suddenly turned into one of mockery. Oh, like you would have done any better. All anyone would have to do to fool you is put on high heels and a wig, the goddess jabbed back. It happened one time. Hermes, with a fiendish smirk, looked back at his brother as he remembered another particular incident. How about that one night in Venice? Exne on the Oisbe Ightnay. The god of the sun's voice reached fever pitch as he threw himself on the god of messengers. The two tumbled down and joined the foreign sisters' dust cloud. Mirda. Who is this? Ow. Hey. Wait, turns ya bakas. Arie, seeing this, became annoyed. Hey, no fair. I want to join in too. Despite his lover's protests, the god of war took a picture-perfect swan dive into the dust cloud below. My brick queen. I challenge thee. Ew, get away from my sister Teme. The demigods moved back while the rest of the audience just stared, some in amusement and others in annoyance. Zeus at this point looked like he'd rather be anywhere else while Hades and Poseidon watched the fight below with matching smirks. While Hestia made to get up, she stopped when Rhea raised a hand to stop her. Any earlier amusement had vanished from the tall immortal's face. While it had been amusing for a spell, she didn't want it to devolve into a full-out brawl with the whole family. She could practically feel Zeus' patience reaching its limit too, if the way he was twitching was any indication, while her youngest daughter took another gulp of her chalice. The air filled with tension despite the sounds of the ongoing fight as the Titaness rose to her full height, her gorgeous features highlighted as her eyes were hidden under an ominous shadow. Go. Ome wa mo shindiru. Rei's voice was coated in steel and sent a shiver down all her family members' spines. The group stopped abruptly. Amaterasu was pulling at her sister's hair and pushing Ares back with her foot on his face. Quetzalcoatl was biting her sister's forearm while also pushing back the god of war, who was doing everything in his power to smother his face in the blonde deity's abs. Standing among them with their feet caught in between the three bodies, both Hermes and Apollo were holding each other's shirt and had their hands reared back. As one, the group turned to the approaching mother. their faces twisting to horror. Nani. Insert sounds of motherly ass whooping, TM, here. Hades, while content in watching someone else receive his mother's brand of discipline, decided to get back to the chapter. For a moment there, the goddess of the moon witnessed her sister being uncharacteristically hesitant in her speech. I did, but, Athena spoke while Artemis leaned in, now curious. It's illogical of me, I know, but I can't explain it, Artie. Something's been nagging at me for a week. The older goddess furrowed her brows, visibly frustrated with herself over the issue at hand, which made her sister raise her own brows in surprise. Oompa loompa, doompa de doo, I got a baaad feeling bout you. Apollo, whose head was crowned with a fresh bump and with his hand on his sore behind, couldn't resist muttering as he took back his seat with a limp in his step. Rhea tittered as she heard the lyrics, feeling refreshed after the loving discipline she just delivered. The demigods wisely took a step back from her. Nico even hid his body behind his big sisters. A surprising statement coming from you, Artemis said before adding, I noticed some of the papers were written in foreign script. Is this about your request? At the change of subject, Athena's features became calm and calculating and she paced back to her desk. Yes, anything to report? The huntress thought for a bit before shrugging her shoulders, nothing much. Your daughter seems to be in good hands. They've recently made camp near Harrisburg. Athena stopped in her tracks at the information, and her eyes glowed briefly. Ooh, the jig is up, Zizi Hermano. Quetzalcoatl laughed out, even with the bump on her head. Her sister groaned from her seat as she rubbed her behind, where a suspicious imprint of a sandal marked her robe. Harrisburg, she said after a few minutes of silence, tone colored with disbelief, which worried her sister. Yes, the different route puzzled me as well. That's impossible, Athena breathed. Artemis tilted her head. Sister. Artemis, I can feel my daughter. I just rechecked. I know she's nowhere near Pennsylvania. She's in New Jersey, the goddess declared with conviction. Busted. Demeter heckled from her seat with a laugh. The king himself huffed in vindictive amusement. Ha! That'll teach that monster to mess with his precious daughters. To say the huntress was shocked is an understatement. She stood stock still in silence, as she attempted to process the revelation. She had complete confidence in her abilities, as did her sister. Her tracking had never failed her before, so that only left one logical conclusion. Aphrodite took the opportunity to sneakily take a picture of the goddess on the screen's face. It was rare to see Artemis lose her composure like so, but whenever she did, the goddess of love wished to capitalize on it. I do take back what I said about Zetsu before. His appearance may be unusual, but he's quite effective. Here's hoping the little guy could keep running circles around the two Olympians she had beef with. She'd been tricked, she'd been hoodwinked, and she'd been, quite possibly, bamboozled. The audience laughed and giggled at the phrase while the goddess of the moon flushed in embarrassment, much to her lieutenant's hidden amusement. Zoe, who had remained silent for most of the reading, felt yet again surprised by the Uzumaki's skills. She had utmost faith in her patron and still believed this to be partially the work of sheer luck, but she could not deny that it was refreshing to see Artemis be challenged once again. Her lady was always at her best when pressed. How did they do it? She breathed out, more curious than insulted by the revelation of the deception. The smartest Olympian looked pensive for a moment. I do have several hypotheses. She paused and turned to Artemis. Sister, please try to feel for any of the others and tell me what you see, she said, deciding to test something. The huntress nodded and concentrated for a few seconds, before she sighed in annoyance. I still see the same thing I've been seeing for the last few days. They're still in Harrisburg. Athena narrowed her eyes at the answer, before firing off her questions. Did you notice anything about them? How are they interacting with their environment? Are their behavioral patterns consistent? Was there anything to note about? The demigod sans Annabeth turned to look at the blonde girl. Some like Talia and Percy had teasing smirks while Luke held a bittersweet smile. Bianca and Nico, being less familiar with the girl, felt nonetheless like the scene was familiar. Athena. Please. One question at a time. Artemis cut off her sister with a fond smile while the latter's cheeks briefly flushed a golden color. It was adorable how similar both Athena and Annabeth were to each other. The huntress had quickly discovered upon her first meeting with the little demi-goddess that the child was just as curious as the goddess of wisdom. Like mother, like daughter, Hestia tittered fondly as she looked at both Annabeth and Athena. While the demi-goddess felt bashful but happy, her mother's cheeks colored a golden color. Even Zeus gazed upon his daughter and granddaughter fondly. Nevertheless, she pondered the questions and formulated her answers. Well, there was Artemis stopped suddenly as the world around her briefly became muted as her ears picked up a peculiar sound. Ba dump, whose heartbeat is this? She thought. She was sure the room was vacant, so that could only mean. Both Artemis and Athena's eyes narrowed dangerously, as did several gods when they eventually caught on. How in Tartarus did he get there? Zeus' eyes almost bugged out from the implications. Through the bottom of Artie's sandal, Apollo muttered, eyes wide as sweat started to form on his brow. To think they could be infiltrated this easily, sister? Artie. Athena waved her hand in front of her sibling's eyes when she noticed the goddess stop suddenly. Before she could say anything, however, Artemis teleported in a flash of silver, only to reappear a few feet away behind a bookshelf. Get that peeper other me. I'll turn him into a jackalope for this, the huntress snarled to herself. No one peeped on her. No one. Yeesh, lil sis, calm down. Apollo winced at the look on his twin's face. He'd only ever seen her this angered a few times in his long life, and each time ended with either him or someone else being maimed and or killed. The goddess of the moon moved her head rapidly, checking every nook and cranny around her and even taking a few occasional whiffs as she seemed to be searching for something. Aphrodite wanted to quip about her rival sniffing deer excrement, but seeing how tense the room was, and how triggered Artemis was, she chose the safer option and stayed silent. Best not to try her luck too much with the huntress, she might very well follow up on her threats. Artie, what is going on? The goddess of wisdom looked a tad annoyed at her sister's erratic behavior. Said sister side-eyed Athena, who winced at her other self's comment. But upon noticing Artemis' grave look as she came back to her side, the goddess replaced her annoyance with worry. Nothing, I thought I heard someone there, said the huntress, but even she didn't seem convinced by her words. Filing that information for later use, Athena continued her conversation with Artemis. Now though, her words were chosen carefully, as her gray eyes darted every once in a while around the room. What just occurred had done nothing but send her mind into high alert. There was obviously something afoot here, and it would forever shame her if she'd somehow managed to let an intruder slip past their security. Shame. Apollo pointed at his half-sister while his brother nodded solemnly, shame. Shut it you. At least I caught on to him, I bet you wouldn't even sense him. You're on. Hermes. Add that to the challenges. The god of the sun turned to his brother, who practically had drachma signs in his eyes as he pictured the amount of money he was about to make. She'd have to pay Hephaestus a visit. Would Aya want me to do? Add 1 million more satellites? This ain't 1984, the smith rolled his eyes. Don't get him wrong, he was very interested in Zetsu's abilities, especially if they could evade his tech so efficiently, but he didn't want to hear the others complain later about him, invading their privacy. Donuts. All of them, the god sneered inwardly, somewhere under Olympus. Inside a smoothly carved cavernous room, located midway between the busy streets of the Golden City and the burning forges at the base of the mountain, a small figure crawled about on the walls and ceiling. Illuminated by a glowing rock on the ground, the entirety of the room's tangible surface was inscribed with what looked like a detailed map of the city above. The king breathed deeply as he processed what he was seeing. They'd been infiltrated, fooled, and the intruder apparently had enough time to, from what the screen was showing, outline every room in their temples. To think we'd let someone get far enough in Olympus to do that, Athena muttered, feeling shame in her counterpart's stead. As the figure traced a new line, it abruptly stopped. Yellow dot-like eyes blinked in the darkness of the room, as their owner received an influx of memories. Both the smartest demi-goddess and goddess felt intrigued at the last part. The shadow clone in the goddess of wisdom's office had just dispelled itself in a hurry, narrowly escaping the goddess of the moon's gaze on them. Artemis tsked at her other's failure. She almost had the little imp too. That's not good, Z2 thought, his face furrowing in frustration before it relaxed, but also not unexpected. Those two were bound to find out sooner or later. The smart one tracking her kid is not out of the norm. Gekko always did the same to watch over his kids, as numerous as they are. Aphrodite's interest was piqued. A fellow god of love? Ooh. As for the bratty one, the huntress fumed in her seat as she realized that nickname was going to stick, while her brother bit his inner cheek to prevent his laughter from escaping. Original would no doubt be a little annoyed about his clone's performance. That or they just underestimated how observant the huntress could be. That was a dangerous line of action. They couldn't afford to be careless, much less take uncalculated risks, which was the reason for Z2's use of the shadow clone technique. It was fast, it was efficient, and most importantly, it allowed for instant transmission of data. Annabeth pouted in envy at the ability, so unfair. She whined while her friends rolled their eyes playfully at her. She would have probably used the power to read multiple books at the same time. Athena didn't admit to it, but she felt the same way too. She might be able to divide her consciousness into multiple bodies, but those bodies still retained the same mind and thus required constant focus. The statement also drew frowns from both the king and queen as they realized the true danger the Uzumaki posed. Only one problem though, I can't keep up with the chakra consumption, the clone thought, visibly tired. He's been producing several clones every day and dispelling them at random intervals, working and noting down the information with very little time for rest or anything else, and since the core of the technique was to have your chakra reserves at each use, it was too much effort for not nearly enough results. Huh. So it does have a drawback, the goddess of wisdom noted that down. Having your entire reserves on a temporary copy was also highly irresponsible. Even with dozens of shadow clones, Olympus was still a massive surface to cover, and that didn't even include its other territories, which Z2 hoped to be able to scout out. Add to that the hassle of gathering biomass, while remaining undetected from the extensive network of surveillance devices through his use of underground pipelines and mayfly, while sifting and sorting through his scouts' data. He could only do so much as a single full-blooded duplicate of the original. He needed more. More of himself. The solution to the matter was obviously to gather more biomass at a faster rate, but that was easier said than done. It had taken him days of scrounging around for food like a common rodent and devouring every half-eaten plate left by Olympus residents, just so he could gather enough biomass for one fully grown body. Ugh, Hera sniffed in disgust. She would never expect an immortal to stoop so low as to act like a vulture. It would take him weeks to assemble a workforce large enough for his needs. Unless, a sudden idea sprung up in his mind. Z2's eyes shifted on the walls, scanning over the drawn map, before they rested on a wide section at the eastern section of the Golden City. Hades almost giggled at the next line, while his serial-obsessed sister felt dread creep up on her. Demeter's protégé, Hades, in a moment that surprised his relatives, especially his children, exploded in laughter. Hee 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 ha ha ha. I was right. That Zetsu is truly one of a kind. The god of the underworld felt happier than he did in years, and went as far as to point at his shocked sister mockingly. I can't wait to see him ruin your precious garden. Hades, come now. Hestia and Rhea were very much not amused at the god. I don't care. He's my favorite character. The goddess of agriculture squawked in outrage and stood up, the corn cobs woven in her hair starting to pop in reaction to her mood. If that little monster harms a leaf on my baby's stems, I swear to Gaia I will be shoving a pitchfork right up both of your. Demeter. Hades snickered to himself and resumed reading, much to his sister's frustration as she sat back, fuming to herself as corn kept popping from her. Some of the popcorn landed by Quetzalcoatl, who nonchalantly picked it up and ate it, much to her sister's disgust. It was a risky idea, one that could very much blow his cover, but if her stuff is anything close to the Taoist's peaches of immortality, then that could work. Squashing her curiosity at the mention of other divine fruits, Demeter crossed her arms and glared at the Uzumaki. Even if he did share several aspects of her domains, and even if he was the son of a pantheonic threat, she would hunt him down if he so much as damaged her precious protégé. He knew that divine fruits held properties that far surpassed anything mortals could find on Earth. If Demeter's stuff held even a fraction of the peaches from the Jade Emperor's garden, then he'd only need a couple of them. He's not touching a single one. Not my babies. The goddess of agriculture screamed at the screen, even as both her sisters moved to calm her down, while Hades snickered to himself. In the darkness of the room, Z2 narrowed his glowing yellow eyes and made a decision. With a swift activation of Mayfly, the ground shifted and became muddy under the Spymaster's feet. As the clone disappeared into the earth below, the ground turned solid again, leaving no trace of the clone's presence. Both Athena and Artemis blinked owlishly. They had been curious as to how the spy could move seemingly undetected by them, and seeing him simply swim through the ground was a little jarring. Sure, it was something anyone with an affinity for Earth could do, but to the Uzumaki, coupled with his apparent ability to mask himself, it was the perfect tool to conduct flawless espionage. Hephaestus raised a brow, just as surprised as the two goddesses, and flipped a page from his notebook to jot down something. Need underground sensors. Maybe ultrasound? Also, tightest security net on the planet. My behind, the god grumbled to himself as he recalled Athena's boast in the past, all those hours spent on those satellites, wasted. Extra scene. The best way to bond, oh? Hestia leaned forward in her seat. Makepeace Lake, Atlantic County, New Jersey. While the Zetsu clones were occupied with their game of 4D chess against two goddesses, the original, still in his blonde disguise, laid under a tree awake and looking back at the rest of his travel mates. Oh please, as if 4D chess would cause any version of myself such a headache. Athena rolled her eyes at the comparison. Annabeth internally wished to one day play a game with her mother. The real group of travelers had continued their road north while keeping close to the shore, and had now reached a small woodland at the edge of a lake. A good spot to spend the night, even if there were a bit too many mosquitoes for the three demigods' liking. Ugh. Zoe scrunched her nose. Even after thousands of years in the wild, Those little pests were still as annoying as ever. She would dare to call them the greatest beasts the hunt has ever encountered, as even her lady's charms didn't seem to completely block them from their tents. It was yet another reason why the hunt preferred to move to the north of the country in the summer. But the reason for the Uzumaki's lack of sleep didn't have anything to do with blood-sucking insects or the infiltration of Olympus. Those issues weren't on his mind right now. What is that gremlin planning? Zeus narrowed his eyes in suspicion while his wife rolled her eyes at him, but internally felt just as curious. As time passed and he started hearing his father's audible snores, he got up from his position and made way to the man's side. Hey sis, you think he's about to do that? Quetzalcoatl grinned as she whispered conspiratorially in Amaterasu's ear, who in turn muffled a giggle. The interaction got them a raised eyebrow from both Hestia and Rhea, who could feel the amusement wafting off of them. Demeter scowled heavily as the corn in her hair still popped every once in a while. He nudged him and prodded him a few times at first, then wound up his foot and delivered an earth-shattering kick to Naruto's side. Hestia's eyes widened at the sudden assault. That's not. Clang whatever the goddess wanted to say, she stopped in surprise, as did many around the room, from the loud sound that reverberated. It was something she was sure to hear in Hephaestus' forge. What the, how durable is he? Athena spoke in genuine surprise. As hard as iron, that's pops for ya. He winced slightly at his bruised foot before his healing factor kicked in and fixed it. I wonder what else is hard. Aphrodite bit back the comment, not willing to incur Hestia's wrath. The sage continued sawing logs, none the wiser of what just occurred. Is that normal? Bianca asked nervously. She'd heard of heavy sleepers, but this looked like a whole other level. Papa's body is special, Amaterasu hesitantly explained. It's difficult to explain. Wasn't that because of Yama's, the Aztec started speaking only to be shut off by her sister outright hissing at her. Yes, Quatsi, yes it was. I think Papa wouldn't like if we talked about that subject. The younger goddess actually cowed from her sister's glare. Amaterasu's eyes, seeing her sibling's expression, softened as she gave her a side hug and whispered a brief apology. The tender moment was interrupted by Hermes, who shrugged. I mean, with our luck it might be revealed eventually, Sue. He trailed off, while some of the audience nodded in agreement. The Shinto turned her sharp gaze to the god of messenger, who shrunk in his seat. If it is, then so be it. But on the off chance the book does not discuss it, I hope you can understand this is a private family matter, Amaterasu stated firmly, while her sister got more comfortable into her embrace. Rhea smiled at the two, and reached out to tenderly hold the Shinto's hand. I understand, sweetie. Please forgive us for our curiosity, but your father does have a lot of interesting and unusual traits. The Titaness tone was soft. The same tone she would often use on her own children, and both the foreign sisters reacted positively to it, nodding in gratitude and turning back to the screen. Those like Zeus or Athena internally lamented the missed opportunity. They could have learned of a possible weakness for the sage. Seeing this, Zetsu's disguise shimmered as a sinister Glasgow grin appeared on his face. Hey, it's one of those nights, he thought as he turned and made his way to the demigod's prone figures. Hey, wake up, he said plainly while gazing down at Luke. When the teen didn't answer, the Uzumaki shrugged, wound up his foot for the second time that night, but stopped before he could make contact. Luke breathed a sigh of relief. Instead he nudged Luke's side, on a spot he knew was ticklish for the teen. How did he know that? The rogue demigod asked loudly, finally breaking his silence, as many giggled around him. That's Zizi Hermano for ya. He knows where everyone's manchas de Casquilas are. Demeter huffed, still angered at the threat to her other's potager. Talk about creepy. Hades rolled his eyes at his sister. Oh, get over it, it's not the end of the world. It's the principle of the thing, you kidnapper. Sticks and stones, sister. Bianca shook her head at her father. Somehow, seeing him bicker with his sister was making her understand where Nico got his bratty attitude from. The sleeping demigod snorted loudly as he jolted awake, eyes wide and confused before they focused on the person intruding his slumber. Zetsu. The boy yelled, before remembering where he was. What do you want? He continued whispering harshly. Hermes chuckled at his son. He reacted the same way every time Apollo sent his son's rays at his eyes. The way Zetsu looked back at him unnerved him, with eyes both cold and intense. For a second, the teen thought he'd seen 2 rows of razor-sharp teeth where the other blonde's mouth would be, but as he blinked the sleep from his eyes, the sight that greeted him was a more normal, if not just as unnerving, grin. During the time he knew him, he realized that grin only meant trouble. Nico shivered as he looked at the smile and hid behind his sister. He's scary, sis. Bianca petted the boy's head with a smile and a shake of her head. Somehow, the thought of her brother finding Zetsu's human disguise to be scarier than his true form was funny. Wake up the others, we're gonna have fun." As soon as he said this, the Uzumaki turned around and walked back to a bag at the side, shuffling in it as he retrieved some items. Huh. Just do it. Zetsu didn't turn around from his work, while the demigod furrowed his brows in annoyance. Luke also frowned with his counterpart. He didn't like being bossed around. Hermes for his part felt his pranking senses, pending trademark, tingling. "Whatcha think Zetsu wants to do?" Talia asked her friends, who all shrugged. "What does the jerk want now?" he thought, briefly pondering the benefits of ignoring his fellow blonde and going back to sleep. Just as he turned to do so, however, he caught sight of the adult of the group in deep sleep. The son of Hermes felt his inner prankster surge out as the situation finally became clear to him. Hermes couldn't suppress the proud grin that formed on his face. Hey, threatening him with a good time. He just might take back half the mean things he'd thought about the guy. With that he nodded to the Uzumaki and set out to wake the others, making sure to poke Talia with a wooden stick, just in case the demi-goddess literally and figuratively jolted awake. Percy snorted loudly before laughing to himself, only to yelp as Talia shocked him lightly with her finger. Luke made sure to hide his chuckles, lest his former friend do something more painful to him. Huh? Luke? Was it? His best friend and surrogate little sister both groaned as they woke up, sounding and looking more like the undead at that moment. Hades raised a brow in amusement at the comparison. Ironically enough, some of the undead under his command were far more lively than expected. Before they could ask anything, Zetsu came back and dropped a bundle of colorful items to the ground in front of them. Luke blinked at the sight of the objects before a veritable Hermes-like smirk bloomed on his face. "That's my boy." Hermes couldn't help but cry out. Luke blushed despite the scowl on his face. Talia chuckled fondly at the picture of her former friend. Those were the good times. Annabeth and Talia mirrored him as the youngest demi-goddess stifled a few giggles. Athena and Zeus stared numbly at the screen. They wanted to be mad. They should be mad. Had it been any other, pantheonic threats, Olympus might have ended up burning to cinders from their children's audacity. But at this point, both felt like this story would contain a lot more similar moments. Rhea, the demigods and the foreign deities all laughed or giggled in excitement. Hours later Naruto's eyes blinked open as the first rays of the sun tickled them. Damn, another one of those nights, he groaned and adjusted his legs, raising his pelvis to the sky as he balanced on his head and feet. As he did so, several frogs, birds, and even water snakes jumped off of his body, having taken to spending the night on him. Zoe muffled a giggle. This reminded her of some of the days when she caught her lady sleeping next to her wolves. Some of the ladies in the room, however, did not find the sight as heartwarming. "I have no idea how he can even sleep like this." The goddess of agriculture couldn't imagine waking up to a snake using her as a pillow. Curiously enough, the screen remained blank. Crack-a-cock-a-cock-a-cock-a-cock. The audience jumped at the abrupt sound, while Aries raised his head in alert. Was that an Alaska 47? The critters practically bolted away as several sounds similar to firecrackers rang out from the man's back. As Naruto finished popping his entire spinal cord, he sat up and started doing the same to his joints. Crack crack crack. Ooh, Apollo winced into his hand. "I could never call this healthy." "Eh? Por qué?" Quetzalcoatl asked, puzzled before doing the same thing to her neck. "Crack, Quatsi. You'll hurt yourself." The chiding surprisingly came from Hestia while Amaterasu just looked on in resignation, far too used to her sister's antics. "Fine fiend, big sis," the blonde goddess replied back. Rhea internally squealed at how familiar the foreigners had become with them, and in such a short amount of time too. "Hiya, I'm starting to feel like my age," the man groaned while rubbing his back. "Oh, what he wouldn't give for some ramen right now." Demeter shook her head. Honestly, while ramen was cereal-based and was technically good for one's health, the sage sounded like someone who's never heard of the term, moderation, before. He blinked, however, as he noticed he wasn't in the same location he had slept in last night. Looking around, he noticed the hastily constructed raft under him, floating in the middle of the lake. Peeved, classic. Hermes giggled like a child alongside many of the audience as a picture on the screen started to form. Looking overboard, he was able to see his reflection in the water. A big red nose greeted him, alongside various doodles and glitter littering his face, all topped off by a cringe-inducing rainbow wig covering his hair. No one could have prepared the audience for the sight before them. As if to add insult to injury, circus music echoed out briefly from the screen as well. And just like that, the dam broke. Ka-ha-ha-ha-ha-ha. Foo-foo-foo-foo-foo-foo. Hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo. Hee-hee-hee-hey-hey-hey. Ga-ha-ha-ha-ha-ha-ha. Hee-hee-hee-hee-hee-hee-hee. The whole room exploded in laughter at the sight of the clown on the screen. The children were practically hanging off one another while many of the Olympians held onto their seats as they devolved into uncontrollable chortles. Even Hestia and Rhea, ever kind and compassionate, could not help guffawing, especially when the sage's own daughters were among the loudest. Even Zeus, while initially worried about pissing off a pantheonic threat, was practically melding into his giggling wife as both enjoyed a good practical joke. Bianca and Nico were also surprised to see their father trying and failing to muffle his laughter into his hand. "Excellent application of makeup, darlings," Aphrodite heckled between her giggles. After a few minutes, things calmed down with the occasional titter erupting here and there. He blinked, his mind trying to comprehend what he was looking at, but as his ears picked up the distant childish giggling from the shore, he couldn't help but let it infect him. Bah-ha-ha-ha-ah-ha-ha-ha. His laughter boomed across the lake as the man fell back on the raft and kicked his feet in the air, giggling to himself. Rhea smiled beautifully as she gazed at the man's laughing face, and couldn't help the treacherous thought. His smile suits him, the kiddo's first prank. This takes me back. He wiped a fake tear from his eyes, as pride swelled up in him. Not only at the young demigods for managing to pull a classic on him, but at his son as well. Both Naruto's daughters, having calmed down, had an inkling as to what their father meant. He knew Zetsu had a difficult time socializing with others, but the boy was also among the only people on this planet to know about his body's tendency to simply turn off every once in a while to compensate for the many sleepless nights he had sometimes. It was a peculiar quirk, a sleeping disorder born from the torture he'd put his body through over the years, or at least that's what his sister Psychen had said. Any earlier humor vanished from the Titaness's face and her eldest daughters. This statement explained Amaterasu's earlier hesitant reveal about her father's body, but it also did not bode well. A serious expression also overcame Apollo's face as he tried to imagine what manner of trials the sage had gone through for his body to still hold lingering effects. It was similar to Hephaestus who, even immortal, still held painful deformities from the injuries he sustained as a godeling and Hera's own actions. Dionysus, having woken up to the sight of the clown, also raised an eyebrow in interest. He was more curious about the mental scars from that torture. But the important thing was that Zetsu indirectly shared this information with others, which could only mean one thing. Athena shook her head. "I've never seen anyone be happy about a weakness of theirs being revealed." "Mom. Think about it, daughter. The man just told us that every once in a while, his body becomes completely defenseless. If one can understand the mechanism behind that biological disorder, then one can predict the next time the body shuts down." Annabeth replied and got a proud nod in return. As others caught on to the information, some like Zeus reacted positively as a possible opportunity made itself known, while others like the foreigners simply glared at the goddess of wisdom for her words. True they may be, but neither Amaterasu nor Quetzalcoatl wanted the king and NHIS cronies to cause any trouble for their father. His boy was starting to trust Annie, Luke, and Talia, enough to bond with them over a good old practical joke. That was great, perfect even. I sense a bit incoming. Apollo narrowed his eyes. But then, he couldn't just let this go, could he? Didn't even need foresight. The god of the sun cheered and high-fived his brother. Papa Toad wasn't about to let some tadpoles show him up. Papa Toad? Oh, that's so cute. The Titaness felt her cheeks flush a light gold. It was too wholesome. Looking over at the shore, he saw the three demigods laughing and pointing at him. Curiously, his son was nowhere to be found. Ooh, he ditched you guys. The god of mischief fake winced, while Talia, Annabeth and even Luke suddenly felt worried for their counterparts. Well, would you look at that. Fortunately for Zetsu, he'd learned thousands of years ago to book it after he'd done it, it being the prank. Unfortunately for the other kiddos, they hadn't quite grasped that lesson yet. Oh well, fortunately for them, he was more than eager to play teacher right now. The kiddos in question started sweating. So, he cleared his throat, took the time to practice, and pick out the right vocal octave for maximum disciplinary effect. You disrespectful little snots. The shout took everyone by surprise, and came accompanied by a mental image of a cracking belt. Quetzalcoatl practically jumped into her sister's arms and hid her head in her shoulder while Amaterasu simply caressed her blonde hair. It's Papa, Pepito's pre-ASS whooping voice. Both sisters shivered, feeling some phantom pain in their bottoms as they recalled the times they tested their father's patience a bit too much. Apollo, Hermes and Aphrodite reflexively clenched their ass cheeks. While the first two did so out of reflexive fear of another whooping, the goddess of love did so out of eagerness. She suppressed a moan as she imagined the sage manhandling her over his knee and making her call him daddy. Unnoticed by everyone, the Titaness bit her lower lip and lightly shuddered, her body reacting in a way it hadn't for thousands of years. Oh dear, Why do I feel the urge to be punished? To be continued.